Grand Wind Distal Royal Academy of Magic towered above everything, calling out like a dream, one that promised a fresh start and a whole new life. Inside those sacred halls, a young student, hungry for the best of his new life, stepped forward and tried to blast a fireball into existence. But his spell backfired on the spot, smashing into him with brutal, painful force and wiping out everything he'd tried. He sprawled on the ground, getting roasted by everyone, Brat Sama and Black Pig Prince, while he sinks into misery, because he can't even land a clean, simple fireball spell. Suddenly dizzy, he started doubting everything around him, nausea clawing at his body like his soul was tearing in two, while at the same time, a younger version of him in a modern suit materialized, just as lost, staring like he recognized the truth but couldn't place it. The modern man stared at the impossible, wondering if that other young guy was really him, while the fantasy prince wrestled with the chilling thought that these might be memories stolen from another life, maybe even his. His internal battle erupted into a silent scream, anguish crashing down, realization snapping into place. In his modern world, the young man slammed into a deep bow and begged forgiveness from an older superior who chewed him out for a brutal blunder, snapping that he didn't understand how he could hand over those important documents in such a short time. Inside, he groaned at his fate, knowing he couldn't stomach that kind of attitude, especially with the idea of working through the night. The superior's fist slammed onto the desk and demanded the work be redone before the day was out, an icy order that thundered through the fantasy prince's head, making his distress visibly flare. Tied up in the weight of the day, the modern protagonist sank into his own thoughts, clutching a cup as his eyes told the truth. He kept talking to himself because he was completely wiped out. Meanwhile, in another reality, Brad, the fantasy hero, jerked with shock when someone asked if he'd spoken out loud, and he shot back a quick, frantic denial. Back in his own world, the modern protagonist finally made it home, clocking how late it was, same grind, same routine, day after day, and the whole time he couldn't stop thinking about that chat with his balding boss, who actually seemed to get what he was going through. Afterward, he sank into the chair and fired up Final Quest *, his only slice of happiness, surrounded by a graveyard of empty energy drink cans, completely forgetting how many weeks had gone by while he gamed nonstop. When the game popped up that message thanking the hero for bringing peace, he stared at the screen and wished, right then and there, that he could step into that world he knew like the back of his hand from countless playthroughs. Suddenly, Brat got slammed by a tidal wave of memories, his thoughts sprinting as he scrambled to remember every detail from his gameplay throughs, panicking over how old his current self really was. Memories snapped into place, and with them came the truth. He was Brat von Pistol, the Pistol Kingdom's first prince, a ruthless young king who teamed up with the Demon King to get him revived. He remembered the game's story down to the last beat, knowing the hero and his own younger brother would eventually strike him down, because now, after years of playing, he could see exactly what was about to happen. It finally hit him just how dire this was. He'd been reborn as the Black Pig Prince, Rat von Pistol, a villain whose death was already stamped into the script, and when he stared at his reflection, his brand new, bloated body made his stomach drop. His panic didn't stand a chance to stay hidden. Logie, his personal maid, burst into the room with her bunny ears twitching, firing off, "Are you okay? Did you get hurt?" and offering to run for a healer right away. He hurried to calm her down, insisting he was already fine and she didn't have to do anything extra, but his sudden tone only rattled her even more. Logie, still stunned by Brat's sudden outburst, blurts out non-stop apologies, bows so low it's almost reverent, and admits her behavior was way out of line. Then she swears she'll be more careful from now on and begs for mercy. Her whole body shook as she spoke, and from his bed Brat saw it plain, worry flashed in his eyes. Seeing her anguish, Rat's guilt hit hard. He started to wonder if he'd been the one hurting her in the first place, because punishing her like that made no sense and she was probably just trying to take care of him. He stared at Logie, still shaking with distress, and a memory hit him hard. He was the same guy who'd been punishing her again and again back then. Rat fired back that her actions didn't deserve punishment at all because she'd only been worried about his safety. Then he thanked her, admitting she'd been dragged through so much because of him. Logie, smacked with his unexpected kindness, could barely squeeze out a choked gasp, then bowed his head so low it looked like he might disappear. When Rat saw the hurt in her face, he blurted out, "Why are you crying?" fearing he'd said something weird that pushed her over the edge, yet Logie kept wrecking herself, sobbing uncontrollably like she couldn't stop. She broke down in tears and apologized, admitting she'd always been snapped at and could never meet his expectations, and that's why his gratitude hit her like a wave. Brat dropped to his knees beside her, insisting it was her who deserved thanks because his old attitude had been the one that crushed her with needless anxiety. Rat, eyes blazing with determination, swore that from this day forward he'd become a man worthy of a lord and demanded whether she'd keep serving him, asking if her master could ever be proud of what she did. Loji burst into tears, overwhelmed with joy, and vowed with her whole heart that she'd stay loyal to him no matter what. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling as his new reality sank in, and all he could think was one terrifying truth. In this world, death was coming for him no matter what. He replayed the game's plot in his head. Ra would get crushed by the Demon King and his 4 heavenly generals, then the king would hunt him down and assassinate him. It felt way too easy to just dodge death by being cautious, so he made a brutal vow. Starting now, he'd cast off his darkness for good. He stared at his reflection, grimaced at how hideous he looked, and swore he'd change his appearance, starting with a diet. With fresh fire in his chest, he started pounding his workouts hard, swinging at empty air like it owed him money, then yelled that he'd diet and train until he could beat the Demon King and the 4 demon generals into pulp. He got out of breath fast, but he didn't back down for a second. Still wheezing for air, he shouted Loji, and right on cue, she popped in, proving she was right there. Then he demanded she clear every last sweet from his room, and Loji, balancing a tray stacked with pastries, gushed that they were delicious, only to ask if they somehow didn't hit his taste. He admitted he'd decided it was time to shed a few pounds. He told her to scatter those sweets across the slums and into the orphanages, then added that if she had a big pile of brothers and sisters, they'd be thrilled to come home with some too. Loji, crushed by his insane generosity, blurted his name in total awe, realizing she was staring at expensive treats she could never afford. He handed the task to her, and the next day she jumped at it. Then he ended up at the back of the royal palace, right where the first military training ground stood, and that's when the memories from his past life came crashing back. As he strode forward, he spotted a guy passed out under a huge tree, and for a split second, panic hit because the training ground was supposed to be farther ahead. Then he clocked the sleeping face, Juras, the demon slayer. He tried to shout and get his attention, but the hero stayed completely clueless, like he was brushing him off on purpose. He stepped up to the now-awake hero and with a confident grin introduced himself as the first prince, then asked what he was doing here. Juras, the 7th hero and demon slayer Juras Stresemann, even offered him croquettes and insisted he take them home. The rat wasn't satisfied. He shot back that he didn't want food at all. He wanted Juras to train him as his disciple. You were pushed to respond and you shot back instantly, straight up no, claiming it was impossible. Then you snapped that training kid would be nothing but non-stop trouble, stealing your precious sleep, so you'd be the one facing them tonight as their opponent. He scoffed at Brat's sudden urge to start training right at this late hour, because Brat had never even stepped foot on the military training grounds and had always hated that stuff. Plus he laughed at Brat's old, pig-like physique and claimed Brat had probably never exercised a day in his life. Brat shrugged off the insults and vowed to grow up and fix himself, even though he'd basically slacked off before. Then he laid it all out. This training wasn't just drills, it was the last shield before a disaster hit. And the man everyone was searching for, hidden right inside the military grounds, was him, the hero Geras. He stared at Brat and challenged him to understand how deadly this really was, because in his eyes, Brat was too weak for the weight of it, and he'd crack the moment the pressure started. Even with Geras brushing him off, Rat dropped to the ground and begged, wildly desperate to be accepted as his disciple, and when Geras saw how real his plea was, he froze, baffled, even wondering if Rat was actually dreaming. Right after that, Geras slammed the decision down. He was going to test Brat, and Brat couldn't ignore it. His pride was gone in a totally unexpected way. In the back of his mind, Brat clocked it as a turning point, because in the game the protagonist only made it to the training grounds after Geras pushed that idea, so the exact timing of Brat's own request mattered more than anything. Geras shot out a thunderous kick and nailed Brat right in the face. Brat yelped in pain. Even though he'd seen it coming, he still couldn't dodge the brutal hit. Rat crumpled to the ground, clutching his head in pure agony, cursing how he ruined everything, while Rat hovered over him, stone still and impossible to read, offering not a shred of comfort. From the shadows, Jiras's voice slashed through the air, taunting Brat and ordering him to stay in his place, every word dripping pure disdain. You were told to reach out and extend your hand to that fallen Brat, and he stared up at you, trying to figure out if his whole world really was that hopeless. Subrat's face went white with shock, then Jiras grinned wide and announced, "I passed the test." You were told that Brat really could ask to be trained by him, and Brat, flooded with gratitude, thanked his new master with shining excitement, counting down the days for their training. Pure excitement surged through him as his fist shot up in triumph, and Juras, watching him, replayed their last run-in. Rat's defense had been totally useless, but he still reacted like he'd predicted the attack's exact point of origin. Juras felt it in his gut, something about to get insanely interesting. As Brat grinned with pure, uncontested joy, a sly thought flickered in Juras's mind, an unspoken nod to the young man, Bratka. Juras locked eyes with the boy and grilled him in his head, trying to figure out if he was the real deal or just putting on a show, so he demanded Brat prove himself. Brat didn't flinch. He roared his promise and vowed to give it everything he had. And just like that, even with a small slip-up, Brat became an official Juras disciple and charged straight into the very first step of a brand new life. A brand new day cracked open, and Logie stretched out on her bed with a slow, sleepy yawn until Lena, the maid on the bunk above, watched her and asked if she was okay, then pointed out just how awful her face looked. Logie yawned again, then shrugged it off like, "I'm just a little sleep-deprived." Meanwhile, Lena yanked on her dark maid uniform and got ready fast, then blurted that their master had been weirdly fired up lately, pushing himself hard, and she couldn't figure why. From her bed, Logie stared in shock, thinking, what kind of master fights this much? Then Lena snapped her gaze to Logie and asked, dead serious, if their master wasn't pushing her too, making Logie gasp. Logie puffed her cheeks and pouted as Lena kept needling her, saying that a face as cute as hers would be ruined by dark circles, and that she should rest while their master's kindness was still on full display. So Logie fired back that her master had always been kind, and Lena shouldn't treat her like some kid. Right as Lena finished getting dressed, she teased Logie, "Don't get mad," then reminded him that their master, Bratsama, has always been kind, even now. Logie still looked furious, but with a reluctant hump she admitted she got it and promised to be careful. Then Lena cut in, warning her not to push herself because watching her collapse would be heartbreaking. Lena then snapped her eyes to the window, and the second she spotted what was out there, her expression went sharp. Logie followed her gaze and spotted Jurasama outside, drilling hard like his life depended on it, shouting for one last try as he pushed himself without mercy. Watching him, Logie couldn't help thinking, that's the one I'm rooting for asterisk, because he was going all in today too. Hugh Rass, right there under their watch, collapsed on the ground in total exhaustion, eyes crossed, and Lena said she figured he'd tap out after one day, yet somehow a whole week had already gone by and he was still standing there, proving just how stubbornly impressive he was. She spun toward Logie with that sharp, for real, look and asked if he could actually back someone like Bratsama. Then Logie's face crumpled as he admitted Bratsama looked absolutely wrecked. Meanwhile, Logie's face flared with a blush. She couldn't stop wondering why her cheeks were so hot, then shrugged it off as a delicious illness, all the while thinking about the coolest guy ever. Meanwhile, Lena peered toward the entrance and spotted a figure closing in, Albert Soma, right beside another maid. Albert, the fresh-faced newcomer, strode in with unshakable confidence, with Lena and the other maid walking right beside him. Meet Albert von Pistol, the Pistol Kingdom's second prince, and nobody else. Through the window, Logie and Lena kept staring as he moved, and Logie muttered, "Even so," while Lena blurted out, wondering why he'd come at all. Then Logie finally confirmed it. He was headed straight for Bratsama. Elsewhere, Duras slumped on the floor, head in his hands and drained to the bone, while a dark-haired man loomed over him, staring like he was waiting for something to crack. The dark-haired man spoke up, a spark of surprise cracking through his voice as he clocked Juras. My, if it isn't none other than... Startled, Juras blurted, "Albert, what are you doing here?" Albert stood tall and calm, greeted him, and nodded at Juras like he'd just finished his early morning training. Juras could only feel lucky. Meanwhile, Lena and the others whispered from afar that Albert was a total troublemaker, and everyone seemed to murmur the same thing. You were hit with a jolt of expression hardening into pure determination as he realized this mess could be his shot, fix their sibling bond right now and maybe stop another death-ending nightmare from igniting again, especially since in the game Albert had already killed him. Albrecht stared down like his world had collapsed the moment he confronted him, pointed out Giora's presence even though he'd refused to train him before, and then snapped, "Giora-san, aren't you a little too heartless?" Dark-haired man watched it all, trying to figure out what was really crushing Albrecht. He kept pushing Geras, saying it looked like he cared more about training his older brother, Brad, than throwing his weight behind Albert, and honestly, that rubbed Albert the wrong way because Albert had already beaten Brad before. Geras knelt there staring up, visibly stunned by the accusation. Yuras, still rattled by Albert's words, let out a nervous laugh and scratched the back of his head, admitting he may have hyped himself up too much, thinking his sword skills were better than his older brother's. Moments later, Juras clenched his teeth in pure frustration, still stewing over Albert's earlier taunts. Then Albert suddenly popped up, casually greeting him like he'd only just spotted him, and with a grin asked if Juras really wanted to be trained by him, pushing for some morning training together. Albert let out a chuckle and brushed off Guy Ras' jokes as pure failure. Then he made it clear, this training wouldn't be drills at all, it would be a full-on match. Brad clocked the moment and tagged Albert a duel fanatic in his head but couldn't deny he was dying to see the fight. When Guy Ras heard match, his eyes went wide with shock. Geras snapped his head toward Brat, begging for answers, then Brat grinned like he'd been waiting. "Win the match," he said, "and I'll teach you a skill you can't afford to miss." The idea hit Geras like lightning, and his determination surged. Geras got it, realized what was on the line, then stepped up to take the challenge, fully aware it was reckless but desperate to build new skills, while Albert watched with a quiet, knowing smirk, and Brad, thrilled by the turn of events, practically bounced away. With everything set and ready, Brat, Juras, and Albert huddled in an outdoor training arena like the calm before the storm. Brat snapped into place and demanded they start the match, laying down a hard time limit. This duel wouldn't end until the morning Judy's bell rang. Right before the match kicked off, Logie and Lino leaned in from the sidelines, Logie hyping Brat like, "You've got this." Then Brat snapped his orders. Geras and Albert should step back and fight to kill, but he promised he'd jump in the second things got too dangerous. Albert just smirked, fearless as ever, saying a time limit was pointless, because he planned to end the fight in an instant. Juras dropped to one knee, clamped his sword in a death grip, eyes blazing and locked in, ready to strike, while Albert faced him across the distance, calm as ever, watching every move. With a surge of resolve, Juras snapped that weakness had no place here. Then he roared, charged straight at Albert, and thrust his sword forward, daring him to finally unleash everything. He burst in with wild speed, but Albert shrugged it off and parried like it was nothing. Buckras stared in disbelief at how lightning-quick and brutally heavy every one of Albert's sword swings was, because Albert's strength wasn't just above him at level 15, it felt like it was creeping toward level 30. Albert snapped into attack mode, taunting Juras for only defending, and Juras got swarmed by hit after hit. He could barely keep his guard up, never mind fight back, convinced he was facing a real-life genius. As the duel raged on, Geras got steamrolled more and more, like he couldn't breathe. From the sidelines, Lena shot her worry straight into the air. Is this even a fair match? While Brat stayed ice-cold and loud, insisting Albert's victory was already locked in. Albert then boom, a new figure materialized beside Brat, jolting Logie and Lena to attention. A dark-haired man leaned in with a sly, knowing smile, and when Brat said the real fight was just starting and they still had no clue how it would end, the whole air turned electric. The dark-haired man shot back that it'd be weird if a fight with a gap that huge, like an adult versus a child, didn't end in a single instant. Meanwhile, Juras and Albert kept smashing into each other in that grand hall, blades screaming sparks into the air, while the dark-haired man couldn't stop wondering what was really going on in front of them. Juras roared in pure frustration, his attacks hit nothing, even with perfect aim and full effort, while Albert stayed ice-calm, noting that Juras' patterns matched the last quest to the letter, so he calmly predicted the sweeping sideways lunge, the drop into a vertical swing, the shoulder slash, and the diagonal cut coming from the left. Albert cocked his arm and launched a brutal overhead downward swing, pressuring Juras to quit his stubborn fight, while Juras spotted a last-ditch opening and knew he had to grab it, right here, right now, or lose everything. With a desperate cry, Juras tried to dodge and strike back, but Albert saw it coming and shut it down in an instant, grinning that the timing was perfect for him to land his own hit. Juras realized his agility stats weren't enough, and that split-second gap left him wide open. Then Albert cackled in victory, drove in the final hit, called the match over, and even threw out the truth that Juras was his elder brother. He gripped Guy Ras tight and slammed the match shut, and Guy Ras, caught totally off guard, only managed a shocked gasp while Rad watched from the sidelines, letting out a quiet breath of relief as he accepted the result. Eras snapped out of it fast, fought back against the decision, and insisted that if his final attack had landed, he would have sealed the win. He wouldn't accept a draw. Right as Albert started to leave with Brad, Hugh Ras blared, "Wait," and Brad, clearly fed up with the interruption, pushed Albert to keep going. Albert's movement stopped dead. He snapped his head around, frustration flashing on his face as he told everyone he was stunned. completely blindsided by his older brother's sneaky tactics, yet he still swore up and down that he never truly lost the match. Then he spun fully toward Jures, demanding to know if he'd keep pushing, and Jures, still boiling with agitation, warned Albert not to get cocky about how it would all turn out. Your ass, looking totally flustered, admitted awkwardly but honestly that things between you two hadn't been smooth at all until now. Albert leaned in, locking eyes with Geras, and admitted it. No matter that he was the younger brother, Geras' skills were straight-up impressive. Then Albert threw out the idea, if Geras was down, they'd train together next time. And just like that, Albert, Brat, and the maids took off. Logie and Lena shot annoyed looks at him and grumbled that they couldn't stand his attitude. Right out of nowhere, Brat popped back up beside Jures and snapped him out of his shock. Then Brat grinned and congratulated him, calling his performance impossible, and admitted he'd clocked the gap in their strengths from the start, which is why Jures had made the smart play to go for a draw. Offered up the chance to train Jures and teach him exactly what he wanted. Praising the wild display Jures pulled off even with the draw, then Jures froze, stunned and thrilled, and could only stammer back. He burst out with pure joy, threw his arms up, and thanked Brat again and again for the offer, while Logie just watched with a small smile. Lena's bunny ears twitched as she turned bright red and boldly said she admired Brat, calling him seriously cool. The other maid, seeing how hard Lena was freaking out, stared with worry and confusion. And Brat, he just made another huge move toward stopping the. A whole week had crawled by since Brad and Albert's showdown, and Lena still couldn't shake how unreal it felt in her head, how crazy it was to even think she could force a draw with Albert, not even now. Meanwhile, Logie, pure energy, trounced in like sunshine, greeting Brad with a bright good morning. Inside the mansion, the Brat, now dressed sharp and looking brand new, geared up to leave. He told a maid he'd be heading to the mountains for a while, and the maid along with Lena watched, stunned, because in just 2 weeks since he was accepted as Guraz's disciple, he'd changed so much. As he started to leave, a maid chased after him, calling out her warm wishes and begging him to come back early for a mouth-watering dinner, pointing out, again and again, how dignified and truly valiant he looked. Lena kept watching, stunned by the sheer transformation, and it looked like it flipped everyone else's viewpoint too. Logie, though, wasn't buying it. She grumbled to Lena that Brat's sudden popularity was making life harder for her rivals, and Lena nodded like she understood the pressure. Logie snapped into motion and took off, straight after Brat. Elsewhere, Brad finally reached the dragon's house and found a stunning white dragon sprawled there, resting in peace, so he stepped in and asked how it had been. With a grin, he scooped up the creature and named him Gilgard, laughing in pure joy because the dragon still remembered him, no matter how different he looked now. Staring into the dragon's eyes, he dropped the truth. He already had one exact place he wanted to be taken to today. Right before they could leave, Logie burst into the dragon house like a firestorm, shouting at Brat to stop right now. Logie, still stunned by Brat's wild decision, snapped at him and demanded answers. Why dump a farewell letter, then vanish into the mountains, claiming he'll shut himself away? Brat only muttered an apology, admitted he wasn't heading back home anytime soon, and insisted they talk about it like it mattered. Logie was falling apart and begged him, please don't go. Then he softly patted her head and boom, she instantly clocked him as cute, panicked from the totally unexpected gesture, wondered why he'd do that, and then blurted out a ridiculously loud gasp, mortified on the spot. Still flustered, she shot back, no way could he leave right now, insisting he stay until at least tomorrow afternoon, and he pushed back, asking why, while she privately ate up the sweet praise, almost unable to resist. Logie's face snapped into urgent panic. She gasped at him. Why, you seriously forgot? You told me absolutely not to forget that Marasama is visiting the royal palace today. Right there by Brat near the dragon's stable, she doubled down on her accusation, slamming him as cruel for forgetting that crucial detail. Just then, a new figure burst into view, Brat's fiancée Marielle Fortes. She said she'd come to check on him because she'd noticed he'd been gone from school for a bit, and she couldn't miss how he kept forgetting their appointment. Meet Brat's fiancée, she's the Duke's daughter, Marielle Fortes. Brat jerked in surprise and blurted Marie's name, and Logie, just as shocked, shot out that Marie-sama was already here. He flashed her a soft smile, but she immediately looked away, her face impossible to read. Marie then urged them to get inside fast, pointing out the bone-chilling air, and Brat agreed without hesitation, with Logie hanging back quietly behind him. She sank into the opulent room, eyes sharp and distant, like she was bracing herself for the hardest conversation of her life. Moments later, Brad, stunned to the bone, blurted out whether she really planned to end their engagement, and she stayed perfectly calm, calmly sipping from her teacup like nothing could shake her. He stood right in front of her, confusion crawling across his face as he demanded answers, stunned that she'd suddenly turned something this serious into the moment of the day. She calmly told him to dig through his own memories and find the reason for her choice, like the answers were already sitting inside him. Then she watched his face tighten with worry. A wave of realization crashed over him as his past self flashed in his mind, a wreck of sloth, gluttony, lust, and greed, and he finally admitted it. He'd gone way too far. She pushed on, saying the last thing left was for him to finally admit the engagement was shattered. Then he shot back that he'd already warned his lord, who declared he had no business meddling. He hesitated, his doubts screaming that the decision might have been too fast. Then she locked eyes with him and asked straight up if he was truly happy with ending their engagement. He fumbled his way through it and confessed he'd forgotten their appointment, like that somehow proved she was right to think he looked down on her. She snapped that she didn't expect him to try and stop her, and he blurted back fast that he was only trying for real to make things better. He looked utterly broken, but she kept going, slamming the truth in his face that since their last meeting, he'd changed so wildly he might as well be a stranger. She told him she couldn't trust him anymore, not when everyone around him and the whole crowd seemed to feel the same, and she admitted she'd let her hopes soar again and again in the past, just to watch them crash and burn every single time. She listened as he laid it out plain. Unless he pulled off some insane great feat, nobody would ever accept or recognize him. Then he pointed to the championship of the Sword Dance Festival as proof. Every year, the Academy throws that battle tournament to crown the strongest, only she could tell that kind of victory was way beyond his reach. He pressed on with a hopeful look, asking her, right then, if she'd rethink the annulment if he became champion, and her doubts hit hard, because the idea of him actually pulling that off felt utterly impossible to her. He swore by the sword god Balzac, protector of their country, that he'd win the Sword Dance Festival's championship no matter what, and then begged her to drop the idea of breaking off their engagement. She stared back at him, cheeks burning, all flustered and unsure. She insisted flat out that pulling off a miracle like that was basically impossible, but he just sealed her goodbye with a bitter kiss and swore he had to go now so he could grow stronger. As he walked away, she stared after him, thinking maybe some truths were safer buried, and worse, she hadn't told him the real reason she'd been desperate to break the engagement. Moments later, now in glasses, he beamed and leaned toward the window, soaking in that mind-blowing view like it was pure magic. He roared that he'd arrived at the heavenly sky mountain, then turned to his dragon, Gilgard, and told him to drop down nearby. The moment Gilgard slammed down on the ground, he bowed to the dragon and told it, "Stay right there." Then he clenched his resolve, because this was it, his very first dungeon, Skymount, and he was going to give it everything. With a ruthless grin, he swore he was ready, then surged forward like a blade. He barged into Sky Mountain's first floor and stared around. This place looked exactly like a dungeon ripped straight out of a Final Quest game. As he strode through the cavern passage, he counted his time, about a month until the Sword Dance Festival, and with his level hovering around 20, he knew he had to level up fast, the smart way. Right then, 3 lizard-like monsters lunged out of the shadows, snarling like they wanted to fight. He stood face to face with those tiny lizard monsters, smirking like they couldn't touch him. "So you showed up fast, huh? Huff, hold your horses, because you're not my opponent." With a huge, almost playful grin, he bragged that he'd let them slip right away, then watched as the little creatures scattered and scurried off. He let out a low chuckle and told his reasoning. These little pests weren't worth a second thought, not when his goal was leveling as fast as humanly possible, and they barely even gave him experience. His face snapped into focus, a tiny bead of sweat rolling onto his brow as he felt it. Something huge was right there. Here it is. After what felt like forever, he finally spotted his target, an enormous snake-like monster, so perfectly fused with the cavern walls it looked like the cave itself was alive. He'd spent half a day hunting it, and the moment he saw it, he knew this was no ordinary beast. It was the rare one. The creature spat a low hiss, and its scales shimmered like faint ghostlight in the dark. Rat clocked that the orichalcum snake snapping into the world around level 25 scared way too easily, and he knew this was his one shot. When the snake coiled and readied its strike, Rat dug in, shouted now, and lunged. With a sudden, decisive slash, he fired off a brutal penetration strike, his blade slicing straight through the snake's tough hide like it was nothing. A wave of pure satisfaction hit him the moment his level jumped. Then the defeated orichalcum snake crumpled and spat out orichalcum, a high-resistance material so valuable it could power defense that laughs at skills like his Jura's penetration slash. He smirked, already raring to keep snowballing his leveling. All right, brace yourselves and let's push forward. He pushed deeper into the dungeon when, bam, he ran straight into a squad of adventurers, and right in the middle he spotted Mina, one of the 7 heroes who'd be showing up for the quest's final showdown. He blurted her name, startling her, and she stared back in confusion like, "Why do you know my name, Naya?" And in that instant he realized he'd let it slip by accident. She stared at him, stunned, and blurted, "Are you some rich young master from a fancy place?" Because that noble look on him screamed status, just like the name Mina Libert, the Kate Sith dual swordsman, on her. He quickly shot out a sorry for startling her, then introduced himself as Brat, firing off the details fast, and told her he'd remembered her from a past visit to her Kate Sith settlement with his father, straight up admitting he thought she was pretty cute. Her cheeks flared with embarrassment at his compliment, but she admitted his explanation for how he knew her name actually made perfect sense. Meanwhile, he couldn't help wondering if his quiet, innocent act had truly sold it. Then she shoved the conversation aside and demanded answers. Why was a Kate Sith wandering through something as twisted as a labyrinth? She declared who she was, showing up to run a preliminary probe, or, more honestly, to dig into the truth firsthand. With her party right there beside her, she laid out their plan. By next month, they'd assemble a massive subjugation party, storm the Sky Mountain dungeon, and take down the Cyclops. He nodded when she laid out their goal, the Cyclops buried in the dungeon's darkest depths, and then his face tightened with worry, because the Kate Sith village was under that monster's grip, demanding sacrifices, and even with a huge party, fighting something that strong would almost certainly end in defeat. She stared in shock at how much he knew, but he brushed it off fast, saying he learned all of it from his last visit to her village. Frustration flashed across her face as she snapped that they couldn't just keep swallowing the Cyclops' demands, then pressed him on how some outsider could even begin to understand their struggle. In his head, he admitted she was right, this was complicated. She cut him off again, saying the settlement had already chosen its path, and when she clocked his weakness, she told him straight, "Take care and don't let the Cyclops' people catch you." As she spun to leave, he wrestled in his head with what to do next, then she just bid him goodbye. He watched Mina and her crew march away, and his mind spun at full speed, because he knew the Cyclops was going down in a hero showdown 4 years from now, with Albert and Mina right in the middle of it. Then he sized up Mina's current power and guessed she was around level 20, just a little weaker than the Cyclops' brutal level 25. He clenched his thoughts, knowing Mina and her crew were headed straight for a brutal end if they stuck to this plan, while the Cyclops takeover loomed in his mind, something he'd seen would happen years from now. So he wrestled with the terrifying question, should they really mess with the future that's already set? For now, he chose to back off and head home. Mina watched him vanish as he and she split their paths, and she couldn't help but wonder what a strange, intense guy. Not long ago, the Kate Sith village got slammed by a savage assault. Homes burning, villagers screaming as terror swallowed the streets. Out of the chaos, a hideous monster calling himself a Demon King General, Cyclops, marched in and announced he owned the place, demanding sacrifices so his attack would stop. Worried lines carved his face as the village elder pressed Cyclops for the truth behind his smile, remembering how the Demon King was sealed years ago by Jurasama and the 7 heroes. Cyclops scoffed at the elder's words, dropping the mask and laying out his real plan: wake up the Demon King and bring him back from his slumber. He said he'd need an insane amount of magic, and since the Kate Sith were basically living power sources, their comfort had made them the perfect targets. Mina and her stepmother stared on in pure horror. While Cyclops kept booming his speeches, Libert, the young Kate Sith warrior, snatched a dagger in his fist and lunged forward to call the monster out, denying its claim that they were soft and complacent. And before anyone could stop him, his mother and stepmother shrieked in terror, begging him to wait. Cyclops found Libert's bravery hilarious, practically drooling over the idea of a sacrifice candidate walking in. Then the elder and the other villagers begged Libert to stop, insisting it was insane for someone like him to challenge the terrifying general. Still, Libert locked eyes with Cyclops and, with sheer determination, dared him to come face him. Libert slammed forward, certain that throwing down right now was the only way to dodge their final doom, until Cyclops vanished mid-charge and left him staring in pure disbelief. Moments later, Cyclops slammed back in behind Libert and cracked him with a devastating strike, dropping him hard to the ground. The monster sneered, like it had been laughing at him for misjudging how fast something that big could move. Libert's mother and stepmother watched, hearts in their throats, as he collapsed. Libert got blasted through the air and slammed onto the ground, and Mina watched the nightmare unfold, screaming for her mother as fear twisted her face and the warrior hit the earth. With Cyclops roaring in triumph, he declared the Kate Sith would keep feeding him the sacrifices he craved, and down below, Mina was clutched tight by her parents, eyes bulging with terror as she realized there was nothing she could do against his decree. Mina clenched her fists, jaw locked with pure resolve, because she couldn't afford to lose, especially after those months had gone by since that last brutal encounter. Her cousin, Igard, the young Kate Sith with pale hair, clocked the strain on her face, nudged her shoulders to ease up, and warned her straight. If she couldn't loosen her muscles, she'd never be able to take down monsters she'd already beaten once before. Kate Sith's adventurers, Mina, Igard, and Libert included, stood packed inside a towering pillared hall, and the mood was electric. One voice warned them not to burn out too fast, while another grinned and claimed they'd talked it over 1,000 times, prepared for this exact moment, and just needed to team up to snatch victory for themselves. Libert stood beside Mina and admitted the statement was right, reminding them that they'd already done a proper preliminary investigation a month ago. Mina's expression turned into a determined grin as she steadied herself and promised everyone it was going to be fine, and Libert shot back an equally firm yes. With her resolve locked in tight, Mina rounded up her crew in front of a giant, gold-decorated door, calling it the enemy's stronghold, the deepest cut of Sky Mountain and the Cyclops' hideout, and demanding, "Are you all ready?" With bated breath, she inched toward the towering door and peeked through a thin crack, eyes blazing with pure anticipation. What she saw on the other side hit her like a jolt, her eyes blew wide, and a sharp gasp burst from her lips as she fought to put her shock into words. Inside the hideout, it was anything but empty. Cyclops sprawled on a crude throne like he owned the place, flanked by a nightmare lineup. Two huge one-eyed brutes, a bunch of smaller lizard-like monsters, and a cloud of bats swirling overhead. Kate's Sith crew froze on the spot, jaws hanging open in pure disbelief, while one of them blurted, "Wait, what is going on?" Mina stared at her own confusion and wondered if she'd messed up somehow, but Liber shot that thought down fast. No way, it couldn't be, until Igard, eyes hard with a grim click, finally realized the truth. They'd been set up. The ambush hit like a certainty the moment Cyclops, the monstrous boss, stepped out and crowed that he'd finally gotten sick of waiting. Mina's cat ears pinned flat with panic as she demanded, "Did you really expect us?" And the Cyclops only chuckled, bragging that he could read every miserable thought they had. Mina felt his words hit with icy precision, like the whole operation had been mapped out ages ago, so she tightened her grip on the dagger and braced herself as the full weight of their nightmare crashed down on her. Even with everything stacked against her, Mina snapped into action, screaming at her crew to ignore the smaller monsters and hammer only Cyclops. Just then he barked out a mocking laugh, wondering how many of them would actually crawl out alive from his trap. Far from that ambush across the world, another secret meeting was already in motion. Two shadowy figures perched at a massive round table, plotting something no one could yet see. At this table, Jira's, hat and all, shot straight at Albert, saying she'd reveal Sky Mountain's deepest section only because he'd suddenly asked for it, and while Albert stared hard at her, he grilled her about what she really wanted with information that dangerous. He stared into the crystal ball, and the glass shimmered with a tiny world Mina and another Kate Sith, locked inside the very dungeon Yuraz had warned him about. Yuraz, shaking with growing rage, slammed her hand on the table and demanded she not be brushed off. Then Selly, all long flowing hair and calm confidence, soothed her with a gentle smile, telling her not to get so riled up as Marin shot. Yuraz, cheeks burning, shoved her face into her hands and finally confessed it was true she was hundreds of years older and needed to grow up already. Then she blurted her real name. Merlin, one of the 7 heroes, the great sage. While Sally just smiled like nothing could rattle her, she confirmed Juras had always been like this and introduced herself to Sally, another 7 hero, the Virgin of Salvation. Sally kept needling Merlin, smirking that nobody would clock her if she carried herself with more bite, like her tiny frame and certain details made her easy to overlook. Merlin, so fed up she could barely breathe, unleashed a furious rant, saying she was Marin, wasn't small by choice, and demanding everyone finally remember her real name. Heck yeah, your ass plopped down at the round table, stared into the crystal ball, and swore his buddies were about to get way too loud. Albert and Selly were there too, eyes locked on everything that was about to blow up. Selly stared at Juras with a sharp, thoughtful look and demanded, "Why are you showing us this fight?" "Because fights like this broke out non-stop." Albert cut in and said the fact Gurus was showing them this right there at the round table meant it mattered. Big time. Then Gurus snapped back, reminding him not to tune her out. Albert flashed a small, smug smile and brushed off the idea of special relevance, saying he just had to see it with his own eyes. Then Gurus' side confirmed his hunch, and Albert immediately snapped that they should shut down the transmission because time was running out. Uriz grimaced as he watched Kate Siths march toward their deaths, saying the fight's outcome was already locked in, but Albert shot back that he wouldn't lose a thing by watching it. Then he shot Brad a confident smirk and flat out said he'd be there, making it clear his obsession with the chaos had a deeper reason behind it. Meanwhile, right as the ambush hit, Mina let out a fierce battle cry and ordered her Kate Sith allies to unleash hell. Arrows and crossbow bolts came crashing down on Cyclops, who only had time for a shocked grunt before they slammed into him. Mina, jaw set with pure resolve, shoved her friends back into the fight and warned them their arrows were almost gone. Her eyes locked onto the Cyclops' one massive eye because she knew if they didn't smash that, they'd have no chance of winning. Cyclops roared in brutal agony as a hail of arrows tore into his weak, open eye, and Mina shouted, "It worked." Like she just won the world, then ordered the vanguard to strike at once, while Cyclops buckled and screamed in pure rage over the pain of his ruined eye. Clutching his wounded eye, Cyclops let out a guttural scream as pain wrecked his massive frame, and Mina stood right there, ready to launch the next strike. He screamed in agony when the Kate Sith's coordinated strike slammed into his eye. Then Mina's face hardened, and she charged forward, blade hunting his leg, while Igard shot in fast to back her up. Even with his injury racking his body, he still choked out another pained cry. Then Mina, eyes blazing with determination, said the battle was going better than she ever expected, and promised he'd regret writing them off because he was fighting for her parents and for every villager that was suffering. Then she didn't waste a second. She challenged him straight up, swearing she'd finish him right now and settle every score, while Cyclops, one glaring eye blazing with a wicked grin, braced himself for her attack. But that chilling grin kept stretching as he smugly said the pain was only just starting, and when Min's eyes snapped wide in shock, he couldn't wrap his head around how he could be okay after a hit that clean. With one brutal swing of his massive club, he smashed the air and blasted Mina, Igard, and Liberd backward like they'd been hit by a wrecking ball. Mina stumbled, fought to stay upright, and shouted at her companions, "Hold on, don't give up." Still kneeling, Mina cradled herself as the impact shook her, then stared him down in pure disbelief. She demanded to know why Zai was standing strong and how he could take every hit they threw at him. He just smirked and goaded her, daring her to use whatever was left of her mind to piece it together, then muttered under his breath why she still couldn't get it. Even after the blow, she clung to hope she hadn't lost yet and the fight wasn't over. Then it hit her. Another monster must have summoned a magic barrier, shielding Cyclops. Staring her down, Cyclops snapped that the fight was finished, only for Mina to glare back and shout that he was dead wrong. He smirked, mocked the little girl for learning nothing from her father's reckless rebellion, and swore she'd see what her foolishness cost with her own eyes. Regret crashed into Mina's chest, and all she could do was choke out a trembling apology. As Mina stood there, shattered and apologizing, he launched into a brutal charge, mouth gaping as a terrifying roar tore loose, ready to unleash his full power on her. Just as Cyclops was lining up his devastating strike, a fresh figure burst into the standoff and yanked everyone out of the tension. Then he dropped a quick apology for being late. Mina, still shaking from the Cyclops' brutal taunts and the attack closing in, gaped at the newcomer in pure disbelief like, why was he here? He brushed off her question and said there was no reason to step in. After all, when someone is that charming, she's basically fallen into the mess on her own. Heat rose into her cheeks as irritation sparked. She snapped back that this was no moment for jokes, then pressed him hard to say what he really meant. Ignoring her frustration, he flashed a grin and introduced himself, Brat von Pistol, the first prince of the Pistol Kingdom, then said he'd heard about Kate Sith's trouble because they're sworn friends of the kingdom and he'd come running to help. The chapter kicks off with a bold promise. The Black Pig Prince is going to be a hero, and then Rat strides in front of a massive Cyclops with Mina looking stunned, apologizing for being late and admitting he spent his time prepping for this exact day, even grinding up his levels by wiping out Calcum snakes. Mina, still stunned by his presence, pressed him again, straight up demanding to know if he was really the Pistol Kingdom's first prince. He finally admitted it, snapped with regret that he'd lied to her, and said that now, this late in the game, there was no point in hiding who he really was. Mina jabbed a finger at him, eyes wide, and blurted that he was nothing like the rumors, ones that swore the first prince was an evil, ugly pig, a total inept among inepts, while the second prince was supposedly the throne's sure successor, yet he just let out a quiet chuckle. Cyclops, stunned to the core, bounced off Mina's shock, demanding how a prince could swagger into a place like this, calling it a fool's move, a fool among fools. But Brat just kept grinning, swore he was the evil, ugly pig prince everyone was talking about, then shrugged and said he'd had a change of heart and finally decided to do things right. Then he boldly proclaimed that only a fool would dare take on that kind of mission, yet somehow he still walked around as a prince. Mina locked eyes with him and realization hit like lightning. He was the Pistol Kingdom's first prince, yet he didn't feel like the same person at all. First, she flushed red, her mind sprinting as she realized he was way cooler than she expected, especially after he casually called her cute. Brad watched her reaction like it was a live show. Mina's face hardened as she grilled him about what he planned to do next, and Rat didn't hesitate, his eyes locked on hers as he barked at Mina and her comrades to haul the injured together and get out of the area right away. With the command ripped from his mouth, the tiny bat-like minions he summoned swarmed the area, their glowing eyes locking onto everything. The Cyclops didn't stop, he kept stretching that massive hand out like he was about to snatch someone, and his face still screamed pure defiance. Meanwhile, Brat spun his back to the Cyclops and swore he'd wipe it out, but Mina, watching from the side, clocked the real threat, its power to keep spawning minions forever, along with brutal magic healing that kept it going. She fired back with fierce protests, reminding him he'd already admitted there was zero chance of beating that kind of enemy, and calling his whole plan straight up unreasonable. The Cyclops heard their whole exchange and sneered at Brat, scoffing that he must be clueless to think he could beat it, yet Brat didn't flinch, saying he wasn't forcing anyone to stay and fight because he'd take on the Cyclops alone on his own free will. Brad then snarled that the Cyclops' earlier strike right when it tore his arm off was just a cheap surprise meant to sucker a useless blockhead like him, not some real show of power. The Cyclops snapped, fury blazing as it accused Brad of getting carried away, then declared that its interest in the show was totally ruined. It swore not a single one of them would get out alive, promising a slaughter of everyone, no exceptions. With a furious roar, the Cyclops charged forward and swung that massive club straight at Brat, but he refused to flinch. Right then, Mina screamed a warning, begging him to watch out. Mina stared in disbelief as the Cyclops club, massive and charging with all that momentum, came to a dead stop, stuck hard as stone, not even an inch forward, and the Cyclops, just as shocked, snapped at Brad, demanding to know what he'd done. Brat hoisted the massive club like it weighed nothing, then stared at it in disbelief. Did the Cyclops just stop pushing? While the Cyclops jerked and strained in his grasp, horrified, wondering how a tiny human could have strength that matched its own. Mina watched the impossible, and it finally clicked. Brad had shut the Cyclops' attack down. Still stunned, the Cyclops snapped that Brad must have used strengthening magic, because in its mind nothing else could explain it, while Mina watched in silence, piecing together the truth and realizing the Cyclops had completely misread the whole situation. He kept needling the Cyclops, taunting him for missing the truth that his power wasn't strengthening magic at all. Then he jabbed at his own head and dared the monster to notice the wild fluctuations in his magic. The Cyclops exploded into a furious roar, demanding to know who Brat thought was dumb, while inside he wrestled to get his composure back, brushing it off as nothing but Brat being a total blockhead. Brat, still gripping that massive club, keeps his cool and studies the Cyclops, convinced there's some trick behind every move. Meanwhile, the Cyclops dug in and kept swinging with no tricks, believing that if he hammered Brat without stopping, the ploy would finally run dry and Brat would be left exposed. He kept hammering with that relentless assault, and he couldn't help wondering how long Brat could keep that composure, yet Brat didn't even flinch, calmly declaring that the monster's efforts were pointless no matter how many times he tried. The Cyclops tore into him with a savage flurry of punches, cackling like a lunatic as he demanded to know how long that Brat could take non-stop hits, gasping hard between every brutal strike. Brat stood on that shattered stone floor and finally spilled his secret, no trick, nothing fancy, and even the Cyclops, that so-called muscle brain, was starting to understand the truth at last. The Cyclops froze solid when Brat dropped that declaration. His single eye bulged in disbelief as he demanded, "Did I really just hear that?" Hurt, seething, and desperate, the Cyclops snapped that if it had to come to this, he'd smash Brat with everything he had, then roared for his minions to attack, while Brat stared in shock, realizing the monster had flipped tactics and was calling for help. Rat snapped his head up as a swarm of bat-like monsters dove down from above, their single eyes burning with light, and he couldn't help but curse the unfairness of getting hunted by all of them when he was alone. Mina's magic barrier snapped into existence with a crack, hexagonal, fire-resistant, and instantly sealing her from anything that tried to hurt her. He weighed every option and realized he had to wipe out the bat-like creatures, but one wrong move and he'd accidentally hurt the Kate Sith villagers. With eyes locked in, he started chanting a spell. Tiny flames flickered in his palm as he got ready to blast a fiery barrage. The Cyclops watched Brat's preparations and laughed off his low-tier magic until a fire wave detonated with brutal force, blasting the surrounding area into nothing. The Cyclops froze in pure shock, his one eye bulging with disbelief, while Mina, locked safely behind the barrier, gasped as the attack's insane power slammed into the world. Locked inside the restored barrier, Mina and the other Cape Sith villagers stayed completely safe, unharmed, untouched. Brat rubbed the back of his head like he couldn't believe it, then blurted out how relieved he was that the spell actually worked, because it was his first time ever trying a technique that powerful. The Cyclops, stunned beyond belief, starts doubting everything, like the world might not be real. Every one of his subordinates got wiped out by a single so-called low-tier magic attack, and now he can't shake the fear that this whole thing is just a dream. Rat tilted his gaze to the Cyclops. Now it had bulked up, hardened muscle by muscle, and radiated pure menace. Then, with nerves of steel, he calmly accepted the change and dared it to show what it could really do in this new, terrifying form. He finally decided to end this clash, wondering whether the Cyclops had cranked its emergency, ultimate transformation systems so fast that it all kicked in already. Mina shrieked in terror as the Cyclops, cornered and desperate, raised his threat at Brat, then warned that if Brat even touched him, the Katesith villagers would be slaughtered, because he'd ordered his men to do it with one single command. Brat only shot back a calm, knowing smirk. He met the Cyclops' threat with a calm, confident grin, then basically gave him the green light to do whatever he wanted. Meanwhile, Mina had been watching the whole showdown, and the second she saw it, surprise hit her like a spark. Her cat ears shot up, while the Cyclops' terrifying grin crumpled into pure, stunned disbelief. The Cyclops' shock wasn't misplaced. Brat then spilled that he'd already wiped out every monster lackey, beating them to the village the moment he arrived, and even joked that the Cyclops would have pulled the same coward moves in the final quest anyway, like he truly understood what those monsters were made of. Behind him, the Kate Sith villagers, Mina, Libert, Igard, and the rest, stared on in relief, gratitude spilling across their faces. Rage ripped through the Cyclops as he roared in disbelief. Realizing Brat had outplayed him to the bone, he dragged him through the village, only to watch his scheme collapse and his minions get wiped out, with scattered debris showing the broken remains of a map or plan. Minutes later, Mina and the Kate Sith villagers swept up to Brat with huge smiles, handing him a celebratory cake like, "Thank you for saving us." The Cyclops couldn't let the humiliation go. His fang-studded mouth hung open, and inside he raged that he was an elite monster, certain this turn of events had to be some kind of mistake. His thoughts barreled forward and he couldn't wrap his head around it. Somehow, a normal human was stronger than him and crafty enough to outsmart and outmatch him so completely. He lamented his fate, baffled that a monster like him, so bursting with talent, could make enemies and allies alike fall in line, only to get crushed like this, and Brat just listened, his face giving away nothing. Unable to swallow his fury and wounded pride one more second, the Cyclops lunged forward, roaring a furious challenge, and swung a massive fist straight at Brat. Brat smoothly slipped under the Cyclops' brutal swing in a blink, eyes locked on his target, unshaken, even as the beast's panic drove the next desperate attack. He vanished in a blur, then unleashed a lightning-fast strike straight for his enraged opponent. The Cyclops' huge body collapsed like a puppet, its head ripped clean off and smacking onto the tiled floor with a brutal thud. Mina watched it all, mouth hanging open, filled with pure disbelief. From that detached head, a voice cracked with raw shock and disbelief, asking how someone like Brat could pull off a feat like that, yet he only confirmed what he'd done, eyes fixed on the wobbling uncertainty. With its head still hanging on, somehow still conscious, the Cyclops let out a guttural cackle, admitting it had made a brutal mistake by underestimating that human-like Brat. Rat's face hardened as he stared at the monster and admitted just how deadly it was, because the future demanded one thing: this threat couldn't go unchecked. Suddenly, Rat's calm shattered. He blurted out the mean name, eyes blazing wide with pure urgency. She spun around, baffled by the sudden alarm, but he barked an order: grab the wounded and her unharmed comrades and run from that place as fast as you can. Mina's face tightened with worry as she started to protest for his safety, but he snapped her words away, telling her not to fret and to just go. Realizing just how bad it was, Mina grabbed the Kate Sith villagers and shoved them to run, get out, now, while Brat was forced to stand there and face the danger hanging in the air by himself. Alone, he clamped Mina in his arms and swore he'd drag her with him. This was all he could do with time running out, sealing the door they'd fled through with guard magic to protect it as an explosion ripped the air open. As debris blasted out of the smashed doorway, she spun around in pure shock, screaming Brat's name with pure panic. The doorway finally collapsed, blasting a wave of smoke and dust into the passage, and she could only choke out a terrified scream as the whole place came apart. The grand entrance, cracked and partially wrecked, hung open, and a group of them, including that cat-eared girl, leaned in as they stared into the pitch-black beyond, calling out with worry in their voices, hunting for Brat. Worry carved deep into her face as she scanned the wreckage-littered ground, panicking, because in all this chaos she couldn't find Brat anywhere. Her worry snapped into action. She barked orders at once. Healers rushed to the injured, and everyone else sprinted with her to find that Brat, remembering how the last thing he did was throw up a protective barrier to keep them safe. She barreled deeper into the chaos, screaming Brad's name over and over, praying the rubble would crack and give her any sign, anything, that he was still alive. Right beside him, another cat-eared girl, lighter-haired, coughed out a weak breath as tears spilled in her eyes, choking on regret because she still hadn't even managed to thank him, while her stare stayed locked on all the wreckage around them. Out of nowhere, the dark-haired cat-eared girl spotted a hand pushing up from the wreckage. Her eyes flared with shock and relief as she shouted that he was alive, calling everyone's attention fast. A cat-eared boy sprinted straight into the chaos, yanking Brat out of the rubble, and even with his hair all messed up, Brat looked totally okay, shaking off the dust with a soft, gentle smile as he was pulled back onto his feet. The dark-haired, cat-eared girl surged forward and clung to Brat tight, sobbing as tears poured down her cheeks. She confessed she'd been terrified he'd been wiped out in the chaos, and Brat just breathed out a calm, heartfelt thanks. As Brat stood right there, the crowd around him exploded into cheers, roaring over his unbelievable survival, all because he somehow lived through a blast that should have wiped him out. He gently pulled the cat-eared girl into his arms, apologizing for scaring her, then reassured her he never planned to die that easily. Moments later, the village blew up into pure celebration. Brat, the cat-eared girl, and their crew crashed the villagers' toast, cheering with everyone as laughter filled the air. Then someone brought up the rumor that Brat was really Prince Brat of the Fishtail Kingdom, and he just nodded like, yeah, a lot has happened. The villagers kept piling on praise, shouting that he was the giant killer hero who'd risked his life to save them. An elder bowed in deep gratitude, wondering how they could ever repay him, then Brat brushed it off with humility. Meanwhile, the blonde, cat-eared girl was so overwhelmed she could only think one thing: he was absolutely, insanely amazing. While the celebration kept rolling, the cat-eared boy clocked it fast. Mina, the dark-haired cat-eared girl, was getting drunk way too easily, and once she was visibly out of it, she stumbled over to Brat and blared, "You're the village's hero," before proposing marriage on the spot. Fuming at the drunken chaos, Brat bellowed for everyone to shut it down, then snapped that he still had something to take care of, before storming out of the tent and leaving that wild party to roar without him. Outside the village, under a black night sky, Brat stood his ground against a pack of monsters, towering Cyclops, a mushroom-looking creep, and a snail-like beast, and calmly told them like he'd been waiting all along. With that one eye blazing, the Cyclops threw Brat Soma a wave of deep gratitude for breaking them free from the Cyclops yoke, and swore he'd repay that kindness, no matter what, one day. When the Cyclops reached out with that clawed hand, Brat blurted that they didn't have to repay him, yet he still insisted they stick to their promise from earlier, then pressed them to tell if the real residents of Sky Mountain had truly suffered through one hardship after another. Then he thrust his own hand out toward the Cyclops, daring it to sign on for a contract. Rat shoved a ring onto the Cyclops' finger and kicked off the tame process, using the monster tamer ring to gamble on something huge: the chance to befriend monsters after the fight. He flashed a warm grin at the tiny mushroom monster and swore he'd rely on it from that moment on, and the little thing practically exploded with surprise and happiness, because Brad had even named it Laud. A girl with cat ears blurted that Brat was a straight-up monster for pulling off all that in just a month, and another cat-eared blonde girl gasped that he'd truly beaten it, while Brat, hat and all, stared at them with pure shock. As the chat dragged on, Marin, towering in that huge wizard hat, snapped that the meeting was over, saying she had something urgent to handle. Brat spun toward her and demanded what could matter more than what they were talking about, while the blonde, cat-eared girl chimed in that Brat absolutely couldn't miss the upcoming sword festival. Then he asked straight up if that sword festival was a school tournament for the Fishdale kid, and whether Brad would be stepping out there too. Meanwhile, Dura's light-haired and wearing a tiny crown burst out like she'd just discovered treasure, declaring herself a huge Brat fan and practically shoving Marin to come with her. But Marin snapped back that they were still stuck in the middle of a meeting, calling Dura's an airhead. Brat shot an irritated look and demanded why he should go at all, even telling her to go by herself, while the blonde, cat-eared girl kept her eyes down, clearly embarrassed by the whole scene. Swept up by her energy, Marin reluctantly caved, because she truly adored Garaz, the only one among them who could actually use magic. She made it crystal clear she wasn't trying to be misread, she'd have to size up Brad's abilities herself someday, and she said they could stretch the meeting for as long as they wanted because they could teleport everyone there instantly. Later, she found herself alone, staring into a crystal ball as the truth hit. Guy Raz was already gone, so she muttered, "We're not done talking yet." Deep in the Dream Realm, a terrifying dark fortress called Dream Castle, home base of the Demon King, hung beneath a spinning void, while inside its walls a brutal horned monster howled in agony, its whole body writhing in relentless pain. In the castle's grand hall, a shadowy Demon King ruled from his throne while a shaky minion reported to him, only to be snapped at for every word, because all this human had done so far was crush things like a cyclops. Demon King leaned in and demanded to know whose throat got butchered to let a mere human slip this far. While the Demon King's worries about humans creeping closer clung to the dream realm, a grotesque minion crawled before a brand new, elegant presence and blurted out endless apologies for what it called an unforgivable disrespect. The figure was Beelzebub, the gluttonous devourer. With a lazy wave, Beelzebub shut it down and made it clear he wasn't some pitiful monster you could bully with fear. With a casual snap of his hand, he swatted the groveling minion away, and it crashed and sprawled across the floor. That sinister grin stretched wider as he thought, if the Demon King had fully awakened, this minion would have been dragged into eternal torture and trapped in a living hell forever for its own stupid mistake. Then his mind snapped back to the human who'd already crushed the Cyclops, because if something this dangerous was out there, they had to deal with it right now before it struck again. The shadowy minion, eavesdropping like it on the night, finally spoke up and warned that underestimating the human would bring the Cyclops disaster right back. Sure, they weren't a threat at this moment, but let them grow stronger and they'd become just as dangerous as one of the 7 heroes, so stay hands off their perfectly planned mission. He nodded at the minion's warning, admitting that the human, Jurash, Stresemann, and Pistol had to be dealt with, then snapped a cold order to the groveling creature to get rid of the trash it had become, and the little skeletal thing immediately squeaked back with an obedient yes. The shadowy minion watched him vanish and swore it was time to roll out their original plan. Sure, it could finish the job and make sure the human dies, though it did admit the demon slayer was one tough nut to crack. Then it started wrestling with one deadly problem, killing the prince without the demon slayer ever catching on, and it knew it couldn't pull that off with just anyone. Just then, Beelzebub's eyes snapped to a fresh arrival, a wolf-like guy who rushed in, begged to take over, and swore he'd handle the whole mess. He recognized the Garlov brothers on site, the masters of transformation who moved in total secrecy, and there, 3 wolf-like figures stood ready and waiting, about to be sent on their mission. The Garlov brothers, now fully on board, stood ready for what came next. Beelzebub flashed a wicked grin and ordered them to show the humans, face to face, the brutal mistake of fighting back, then snapped them to move straight to Pistol. Thrilled to have the job, they swore they were ready and embraced the mission with real excitement. Dalmaster Ryanetta, pure elegance, stood there with a confident smile while the white-haired man grilled her, asking if she really had to step in and handle the beast herself. She swatted his worries away and said she didn't mind at all, she'd do it. She even said it outright, wiping a person out of existence was no big deal to her, like she didn't need any deeper reason to join in, just pure willpower, and the white-haired guy had to admit it too. If she decided to go herself, he wouldn't have a reason to stop her. Ryanetem refused to let it be that boring, like taking candy from a baby, so she planned a full-blown spectacle instead, turning her job into something way more dramatic and fun. A white-haired guy kept staring at her, then asked what kind of grand show she was talking about, and you could see the surprise flashing across his face. Rihanna leaned in and told everyone this was a huge step toward their real goal. Then she grinned and said they'd already found the perfect puppet for Pistol. Turning to Arietta, her tiny doll-like buddy, she promised the whole thing was going to be wildly entertaining. The white-haired man let out a sly chuckle, called her plan fascinating, and waved her on to do exactly as she pleased. Then she shot back that she would have done it anyway, even if he hadn't told her. Meanwhile, in a peaceful forest, a dark-haired girl with cat ears stood shoulder to shoulder with a towering winged beast, and the air filled with chirping birds. She snapped her head toward him, a flicker of surprise in her face, and blurted, "Wait, are you leaving already?" The white-haired guy, turning out to be the one she'd been talking to, shot back that he'd meant to vanish the night before, but he'd stayed way too long already. He tore himself away from Mina, swearing they'd meet again soon, and she stared at the ground, coldly accepting his promise with an icy, quiet look. Just as he started drifting away, Mina snapped his name in the air, pure urgency in her voice, and he spun around, shocked, while she sprinted straight toward him, eyes blazing with desperation and determination. In a flash, she lunged and snatched his scarf, yanking him back with a brutal burst of strength. He choked on a gasp, totally blindsided. Before he could even react, she leaned in and kissed his cheeks, soft, warm, and shocking. Her eyes slid shut as her confession tumbled out, shaky and true, I like you." Still stunned by that surprise kiss and confession, he watched Mina's eyes brim with tears as she shoved him forward. "Go, please," she cried, waving him off while the winged beast roared higher into the sky. He glanced back one final time, a shy little smile flickering across his lips, then snapped his eyes forward, because the Black Pig Prince was heading home at last, riding in on his loyal mount. Mina planted her feet on the ground, flailing her arms and yelling "Je" as the winged beast lifted him and thundered higher into the clouds, because back in Pistol, he's about to crash into the Sword Festival. Meanwhile, across the world, the elegant hem of a dark gown whispered over a polished floor as Dalmaster Ryanetta strode with unstoppable purpose. She towered on a high balcony, with Arietta balanced on her shoulder as she stared down at Pistol beneath a creepy, eye-shaped celestial omen, and a wicked grin curled on her lips, like she already knew the hell about to explode, while the innocent people below stayed completely clueless. Rat, a 12-year-old kid, chomped happily into a tiny pastry, savoring every delicious bite like it was the best thing ever. Moments later, a flustered maid rushed up, bowed hard, and apologized to Brat, calling him "Your Highness," because she was swamped at the moment. Annoyed to the core, he scanned the area, already suspecting Marie was here again, because she never seemed to quit. Then there she was, Marie-sama, all long blonde hair and an elegant dress, standing nearby just moments after arriving. Rat stayed planted in his seat and snapped that he wouldn't leave his room, no matter what anyone begged or argued, while Marie, still only 12, stared at his stubborn streak and wondered out loud if rotting in his room for so long wasn't boring, even suggesting a horseback ride would be way more fun. Marie kept talking, saying her mom drilled into her that soon-to-be spouses should stick together and lean on each other with soft strength when life gets brutal, and Rat snapped back, rage blazing as he insisted he'd already said he wouldn't go, then snarled, "Why do you care what I do?" He then barked that none of it mattered, slammed the point home by ordering her out at once, and told her never to come back there again. Marie didn't even flinch at his outburst, she just calmly blinked and said, "So that's how it is." She calmly said, "Then I'm not coming back here again." Rat's eyes snapped open in a flash, and the realization hit like a jolt. He jolted upright, shouting Marie's name, then his stomach dropped as he realized it was all just a dream. Right beside him, a tiny winged creature that looked like a goat grumbled, and Brad let out a huge, shaky breath of relief. He finally rolled into Pistol Royal Capital, Forflet, a massive hilltop city laid out like a fortress, so fast that he couldn't help but stare in shock at how quickly they got there. The city was already roaring with life, daily power flowing through magic tech, right down to those floating magic balls powering the basics, and everyone was clearly in full swing for the Sword Festival. He stared back at his past and admitted the truth before he straightened out. He always leaned on Marie. Now he vowed to smash his way to the top at the Sword Festival, earn the recognition he's been missing, and then pour everything into making Marie happy. He ordered Gilgard to drop their altitude as they geared up to break into the castle, and he even weighed picking up his training with Jirasen the moment they got back. Then a blood-curdling scream tore through the air, screaming that something was horribly wrong. Chaos erupted when the Garlov brothers' monstrous, wolf-like beasts smashed through the streets, ripping into the townspeople as they roared for reinforcements, their terrifying presence spreading fear on every corner. Among the wreckage, one hulking, werewolf-like monster froze mid-rampage. Sensing something new in the air, he snapped his head up and growled, demanding to know who had the nerve to crash their chaos. As the attack crashed in, Lena the maid lunged to shield Logi, snapping at the attackers to stop right there, don't take another step. Brad, watching from the chaos, instantly clocked them as werewolf lords, monsters on the same terrifying level as Cyclope, and he couldn't stop his mind from asking, "How would something that powerful show up here?" He watched Lena fight like a desperate shield, blocking her friends at any cost, ignoring his usual urge to stay invisible because he couldn't turn away, and right then the Garlov brother snarled at her to move, snapping it off like she was just a worthless dummy. A monstrous, wolf-like fiend exploded forward with its jaws gaping, but Brat von Fichtel snapped into motion with wild speed, slamming it aside with a brutal shove, tearing it back with a howl of pain while a blonde, cat-eared girl stood frozen, eyes blazing with terror. He snapped his focus to the blonde, cat-eared girl sprawled on the ground, shouting to ask if she was okay, while behind him the wolf-like creature rolled back into place, fangs out and snarling in silence, ready to lunge again. Still rattled, the blonde, cat-eared girl blurted out that the guy who just wiped out that monster with one hit couldn't be Bratsama, could it? Right beside her, another cat-eared girl and a boy gaped in the same shock, agreeing it was him, and straight up refusing to believe how terrifyingly strong he'd become. Rat flashed a calm little smile and soothed the blonde, cat-eared girl, telling her everything was okay and praising her for doing great, while the other cat-eared girl teased her for shouting so loud and reminded her that Rat could hear every word. Then Rat just gave a soft, "Yes, I am," confirming who he was. Smacked by the wave of fresh terror and the instant relief of seeing him, the blonde, cat-eared girl erupted into tears, clung tight to Brat's chest, and admitted how terrified she'd been. Brat just gently patted her head, giving her silent comfort. Moments later, a maid rushed in to ask what just happened, and Brad, finally calm, let out a breath of relief because everyone was safe. Then a blonde woman stepped forward to thank His Highness for saving them, with a white-haired man nodding along just as strongly. Then he admitted the monster was terrifying, but Albert Sama and a few knights burst in to save them. Right then, the blonde, cat-eared girl yanked his attention and said she'd been shopping with Lena when the monster suddenly showed up, but the maid cut in with the real emergency. Albert Sama was already beaten, and he needed medical help fast. Brad took it all in, realizing slipping a werewolf into a city wasn't exactly a miracle when they could just turn human, and he wondered how something like this even fit in the so-called final quest. Then, with a breath he didn't know he'd been holding, he felt quietly relieved that it never turned into anything worse. As the maid called out to him, Brat stayed lost in his thoughts, convinced werewolves were smart and not the type to throw themselves into flashy, violent scenes, and then he finally realized this had to be hiding something, because the whole thing was just plain weird. When he finally came back, she tore into a warm welcome, and Lena, his maid, burst in with pure joy, praising him for his new strength and fearless courage. She gushed that he was amazing, then snapped back to business, reminding him he had to register for the upcoming sword festival as a participant. Oji, another maid, couldn't help but chuckle at the whole exchange. Moments later, the carriage he rode finally rumbled to life, wheels clacking in a steady rhythm as he pushed forward on his journey. He burst up to the grand entrance of the Wind Distal Royal Academy of Magic, one he hadn't laid eyes on in ages. As he stepped off and started striding toward the academy, Lena stayed put by the carriage, worry carved all over her face. She kept spiraling in her head, panicking that he really needed to show up for school and training after wrecking that monster with insane power, and fretting that his delay was going to set a terrible example, while he stood there, feeling a hot blush crawl up his neck as her non-stop scolding and praises hit him all at once. As he strode across the academy grounds, he felt 1,000 eyes pinning him in place, and the second attention hit, his mind flashed back to the day he got bullied again and again. Now he just couldn't help wondering what they'd think of him, because this sudden spotlight felt painfully awkward. He stared at how drastically he'd changed, thinking they might not even recognize him. Yet whispers chased him anyway. Some students asked who this handsome gentleman was, others insisted it wasn't him, and sure enough, the rumors named him the infamous Black Pig. Back at the carriage, Lena caught the buzz in the air. People swore he'd changed body and soul, pushing himself to serve his people, and that he even crushed a terrifying monster in the city. She couldn't wrap her head around it, but the panic of getting to her classroom fast wouldn't let her slow down. Meanwhile, Dino Schwarzer, an orange-haired student with spikes for hair, laughed off the rumors as pure nonsense, scoffing at the thought that a black pig somehow turned handsome or crushed a monster in one brutal move, and wondering if everyone was just mixing up Brad for the guy Dino was supposedly terrified of. Dino spun toward Brat and shot him a confident grin, saying it didn't matter how anyone tried to dress it up. Brat was still that same stupid, hopeless, ugly black pig everyone couldn't stop talking about. A young maid's face twisted with rage as she lunged to defend Brat from a bratty boy's rude jabs, snapping, "You're being rude to Brat-sama," while Brat himself just stood there, completely stunned by the sudden blast of fury. Meanwhile, the white-haired young man shouted Logi, and when the boy answered, realization hit him like a jolt, because she is. The maid didn't back down. She fired off another heated claim, insisting Brat was the real first prince of the Pistol Kingdom, and even as Brat looked totally stunned, he just stood right beside her while she laid it all on the line. The maid, finally calm, apologized for snapping earlier, and Brat just smiled softly, until Logi froze because yeah, that was her. It had been ages, so at first she looked totally different, but then it clicked. She was Highness Brat's personal maid, the Black Pig, and as Logi put it all together, one thing stuck out: where was the ape? Her eyes went wide as shock hit, then the maid braced herself and listened while the Brat snapped in, his face hard as stone, confronting Logi and blasting him for trying to grab him, calling him a worthless master who somehow only deserved a maid like her. Rat's jaw set as he claimed he was only telling the truth. Then he snapped that he'd put a stop to any cruel talk aimed at his maid, who stood right behind him, brimming with worried concern. Logi barked at the white-haired kid to stop humiliating the maid, and he shot back that Logi hadn't even tried to lay a finger on her. The maid, cheeks flushed, yanked his Brat as she thrust her hand toward Logi, daring him to answer. "What if I don't want to?" Logi smirked, watching the Brat's move. Brat burst forward, ripping through the moment with a surge of power as he spots Logi's hand wrapped in a blazing magical aura, and he growls, "I won't let you refuse, no matter what," while Logi jerks back in shock, trying to understand what kind of power Brat is unleashing and how brutally strong it is. He stood right nearby as Dino Schwarzer, still blazing with anger from their last run-in, got talked about by everyone, and then Lena, a maid, slid up to Brad and asked whether he'd seen Albert Summa, calling him handsome, while a blonde girl watched the whole scene unfold. Dino overheard them calling him troublesome, and rage flashed across his face. Then he snapped that nobody had the right to underestimate him. As Dino's frustration kept building, Brad's stern, unshakable presence cut through the moment, ordering him to shut down his outburst. The Brat's intervention barely wrapped up before Albert, bright-haired and sharply dressed, showed up and tore into their behavior, while Dino hung back in the shadows, watching everything unfold. Albert snapped at Brat, ordering him to quit embarrassing him, because every ounce of shame Brat brought down as his loyal aide would come straight back on Albert himself. Dino tried to jump in and call Brat a pig, but Albert shut him down and drove the point home. "Stop." Albert snapped his focus to Brat, worried about the injury Brat took at the public square yesterday, but Brat brushed it off, saying Albert's associate had been stirring up trouble and his maid had been outright rude. Brat's words snapped Albert to a stop, then it hit him hard. Brat wasn't talking about some random battle, he was pointing at how the same monster had crushed Brat once before and Brat had still managed to kill it. Shot up fast, Albert put on an act of concern, claiming he was just worried about Brad, then volunteering to check him for injuries. Rat snapped out of it, swatted Albert's offer away, and called him annoying, then accused him of trying to catch him off guard. He swore he wouldn't fall for any trick, kept his guard up tight, and challenged Albert to a fight at the upcoming sword festival. Dino just stared, shocked at how fast this tension was exploding. Albert shot Brad a serious look and delivered a final, no-nonsense warning. "Keep your eyes on the throne," because it looked like he was chasing it, whether he grabbed it himself or waited for someone to hand it to him. Albert's warning kept ringing in the air, then Dino Schwarzer shouted that they were leaving, and Brat froze with a shocked look, instantly wondering what that throne move really meant. Still trying to make sense of the news, Brat listened as Dino said the next king would be chosen at the sword festival. And Brat immediately felt that familiar sting of being misunderstood again, while everyone around them froze in shock, because right there, a brutal fight between brothers for the throne had erupted out of nowhere. Then he stared at the mess in front of him, eyes sharp and thoughtful, and realized somehow he'd dodged a death flag after all. For now, he breathed, I think we're good. Just as he was about to think, Dino and a cat-eared girl, both clearly fed up, snapped at him for showing up late, and they made it brutally clear. On his first day back, being tardy wasn't a joke, so that's how his school comeback kicked off. With the Sword Festival practically looming ahead, fresh, exciting days finally kicked off for Brat. He tore himself away from Marin and Geraz, promised he was headed for class, and sent them off with a loud, cheerful, "Have a great day." In a towering arched classroom, Bratzett, this young kid, couldn't stop staring at the blackboard, caught deep in the wild idea of the principle of equivalent exchange, and he instantly knew it had to connect back to the great alchemist Merlin in that parallel world of wisdom. He kept wrestling with his thoughts until one name lit up in his mind, Advanced Alchemy *, that breakthrough collaborative work penned by two people. Still stuck in the classroom, he stared out the window as boredom crashed over him. Then he realized it was time to replay his old objectives and start plotting his next goals for the future. Later, Brat found himself face-to-face with Geraz, hashing out a note that flat-out confirmed it. His old life died, and he got thrown back to life as the villain, stranded in a world packed with death flags, with the worst one set to be recovered in just 4 years. Standing in a hallway, then staring out a window, that horrifying truth kept slamming back into his head. For years later, he sat there with a quill clenched in his hand, scribbling with ruthless focus, replaying the memories of his past life, only to feel safety crumble the moment a grim truth hit. He wasn't just anyone, he was the Demon King to the Heavenly Kings, and this whole setup was going to end with him losing. So he swore he had to crack the problem at its core. Then from above, a masked figure, like the Demon King himself, spoke down and announced that the Demon King had summoned him. A surge of determination snapped Bratz's face into a confident, almost sly grin, and with a spark flashing in his eyes, he declared he wouldn't be stopped. Back in the classroom, he pounded through the numbers in his head, level 56 blazing in front of him, while the class average sat somewhere around 10 to 15, and that gap told him one thing: he had tons of room to play. His thoughts snapped back to Marie, standing right in front of him with a sword gripped tight, confident in his victory in the sword dance competition, until she suddenly declared she was going to break their engagement, throwing a shocking curveball that didn't match any scenario he knew. Now he had to stop the death event, even if it looked like it had nothing to do with this twist. He told himself he'd never lose, but a cautious voice in his head whispered that even stronger or not, failure still wasn't impossible, and right beside him, a tiny winged creature drifted along like it was silently cheering him on. Close-up on his eyes hit you like a punch. He wasn't just lonely anymore, he craved real companions. He stared at his ruined situation and realized that even after reincarnating, he still had no real friends. Tears burned in his eyes, until a wild resolve snapped into place and hardened his gaze. He wouldn't just sit and wait for his fate to take him. With fresh steel in his spine, he swore he'd act, and even said his companions didn't have to be human at all. He flicked his eyes to the ring on his finger, a quiet promise of what he was chasing. Then the scene snapped to him in a classroom, seated by the window with a deep, thinking stare. Meanwhile, the elder leaned in with sweat dripping off his brow, then asked Brad, voice shaking, if he'd answer his question. Rat's eyes went wide as he blurted out that he hadn't been paying attention at all, and then Albert seized the moment, explaining that making a philosopher's stone demands 2 big steps. First, pull out magical materials so concentrated they practically hum, and then fuse them with a magical guide. He went on to say that even advanced alchemy can melt anything, but turning it into a perfectly solid form is a wall no one can crack. The elder's eyes lit up at how sharp Brat's grasp was, and he burst out in awe, declaring Brat worthy of the Prince of Fishdale. Rat flashed a grateful smile at the relieved elder, soaking in every word like it mattered. Then a tiny horned, winged creature beside him leaned in, watching the whole exchange with sharp, hooked curiosity. Suddenly, a brutal, jarring boom ripped through the air, making Brat jerk in shock. Then he snapped his head up, staring like, "What was that?" The elder and Albert spun their gaze skyward too, and Brat's mind raced. Did a monster have crawled out from the magic training grounds? His eyes went wide as he stared up at the sky, and a terrifying realization hit him. If his hunch was right, the consequences could be catastrophic. That gut punch of urgency hit Brat hard, and he sprinted down the arched hallway like his life depended on it, desperate to reach the source of the commotion before it got any worse. He leaned around the corner like he expected trouble, and there it was. The sign screamed, 5th Magic Training Ground ***. He breathed out and muttered that yep, this was exactly the place he'd been told about. He burst into the fifth magic training ground with every sense on high alert for that disturbance he'd heard, yet the place sat dead silent and empty, like the whole world had gone quiet, and he couldn't shake the thought that everyone had already slipped out. A dark-haired young woman, caught mid-change, whirled around to face a startled brat who'd apparently barged into the room, and she snapped that staring was pure rudeness. Moments later, Bratley crumpled to the floor flat on his stomach, face smashed into the ground like he'd been dropped or knocked down hard. The dark-haired woman loomed over him with a hard stare while he blurted out shaky apologies, and she snapped back, demanding to know why he'd been acting so weird ever since earlier. She visibly snapped, demanding to know what he was hiding. Rat tried to talk, but she cut him off fast, saying her country worships strength and won't tolerate weakness. And she leaned in and grilled him again, asking straight up if he was hiding something from her. She flashed a confident grin and claimed that in her homeland Dastria, the strong don't just survive, they pray, and that strength is the only justice. Rat stared at her, stunned by the bombshell. Then he stepped forward with full royal confidence and introduced himself as Prince Brat von Fichtel, and when she gasped in shock, he said she was Princess Carol of Dastria, calling it an honor to meet her, leaving her staring like, how did he even know who I am? Rat sat up, blurted out an apology for how he looked before, then swore he'd gotten way more muscular, begging Carol not to ask anything else. Carol stayed in her undress, stared at him in shock with her arms crossed. She crossed her arms, sighed at him, and told him to drop the formal act, he could just call her Carol. Rat pressed her for answers about the prince's purpose, but right before that, he kindly told her to get dressed. All dressed in a sharp formal suit, Carol stood tall and confident, warning that Dastria was staring down a terrifying chance of annihilation. Then she introduced herself as Princess Carol of Dastria, one of the 7 heroes Cascade, and pointed out the blonde knight beside her as her comrade. With a quick apology for the abruptness, she asked for permission to lay out what was really going on. She spilled the truth about Dastria, how the war with Elnid was a death sentence waiting to happen, and how her emperor father and her comrade Cascade were wiped out in that slaughter. She admitted she only lived because she'd been stuck in another country when it all went down. Then she let it out, Elnid and the Kingdom of Pearls are soaked in hatred, and Beelzebub planned the whole trap from the start. So now, Carol tells the hero she's stepping in as a companion, ready to team up with the 4 heavenly kings and tear her revenge out of the world. She leaned in, eyes locked as she warned her this wasn't some harmless game scenario. If everything stayed the same, Dastria would get wiped out for real. Then he snapped the question, so how do we dodge the worst case? And straight up said it like a threat, there's a chance war could erupt any day now. Soon then she snapped him shut, demanding he stay quiet and listen. She swore that even if they went to battle, Dastria couldn't be beaten. He pushed back, asking what proof she had for a claim that bold, and her words hit him like nails. She stared him down with a blade-sharp glare and snapped that sure, his face looked different, but the fool inside was still a black pig, plain as day. Then she leaned in and dared him to say she was wrong, especially since she hailed from Dastria, the land of beauty and martial arts. He tried to cut in and tell her to wait, he still had more to say, but she brushed him off, snapped that she had 0 patience for his games, and called him out as rude. She kept pushing, calling him stubbornly persistent, then dropped the bombshell. Today was the peace conference with the king of Elnid, and her father would be there. His face went pale with shock as the truth hit him. This wasn't peace at all, it was a betrayal. Albert drew a sharp breath, eyes blazing with urgency, and demanded to know where the Empress had vanished, and whether Carol's family was safe after that conference. Then he pressed for news on Carol herself, too. She nodded and told him the conference wrapped up without a single problem, one clean win that moved the 2 nations a step closer to peace. She soothed his fears, saying her mom and brother were safe and just the same, then urged him to stop worrying, while a soft glow shimmered out from the orb she cradled in her hand. He praised the conference's success and the safety of her family, then snapped into suspicion. Could Prince Vishal really be involved? Carol's eyes went sharp. I can't say if it has anything to do with me, but if it touches my family, no amount of silence will cover it. Suddenly, Albert I was hit by a lightning-fast strike. Before he could even react, a blade tore into his side, jolting him hard. He tipped his gaze upward and found Dino Schwarzer grinning like he owned the place, while right nearby Guy Raz, Lena, and another blonde girl watched Albert close up, admiring how his sword skills had sharpened since last time. Dino declared practice was over for the day, and when Albert blinked in shock and asked why, especially with the sword dance festival looming, everyone felt the urgency hit. He brushed off Albert One's worries and promised he'd take care of everything himself today because Albert One wasn't getting knocked down a second time. Albert One bowed, accepting it. Later, Albert honed his craft all by himself, smashing barrels with sword swings, one after another, while the girls kept gushing that he was nearly as good as Brat, even if he still couldn't beat him. He clenched his teeth, fury simmering as he muttered curses under his breath, and he couldn't understand why his brother was always treated like he was some kind of legend. He stayed on the ground with a fist locked tight, drowning in defeat's bitter sting and choking on the frustration of being left in someone else's shadow. Right when he seated, a shadowy figure slid into view and demanded to know if he was truly the same guy as before. Then she brought up his sparring match with Wolf Road from 2 months back, saying he couldn't even talk about his real power then. He froze, stunned, and immediately barked, "Who are you?" She kept talking, claiming his brother's fighting style was etched in stone, nothing could top it anymore, and when he snapped for her name again, she only smirked and brushed him off like it didn't even matter. Age was already slipping through his grip. With a sly grin, she offered to make him stronger and even asked for his consideration. Then he snapped, told her to shut up, and made it clear he wasn't in the mood at all, leaving her to clock that he wasn't acting like himself. Then she snapped the reminder into his mind. If he ever needed power, he could call on her, before she spun around to leave. He stared, stunned into silence, and when he finally found his voice, he demanded she wait, noticing a tiny smear of blood on her dress as she disappeared. All alone, he gave in, staring at the chaos, begging himself to understand what was even going on, while somewhere else the groundwork kept rushing forward, because the Sword Dance Festival was seconds from starting, and Carol and Brat stood side by side, watching everything spill out in front of them. That same day, right after school, Chapter 9 kicked off and the Black Prince showed up. Alberto, still in uniform, peeled into something else and felt that succubus watching, like she could see every crack in his heart and laugh at how hard he'd been trying to get stronger. And he made up his mind he'd crush his brother himself, even if nobody else lifted a finger. As Alberto kept spiraling in his thoughts, Dino, amped up student energy, came sprinting past and blurted a warning. Don't you dare stir up trouble, because he was already headed to practice for the upcoming Sword Festival. Moments later, Dino was ripping arrows at the target, then his shot sailed wide and missed completely, and right when it happened, another student blurted out whether he was okay, because Dino looked shaken by something nobody could see. Dino smirked, remembering how some people stuffed themselves with frantic, last-minute training, convinced it would somehow magically level them up for real. Just before heading home, he decided to swing by his usual spot for a quick stop. Right there, he spotted Jessica and Myra drilling their sword forms with laser focus, and Dino, crouched behind his binoculars, practically buzzed with excitement as he blurted that Jessica's strength never slips and that Myra's cuteness is downright undeniable. Jessica snapped her head toward him at the sound of his loud exclamations, wearing a confused, slightly annoyed look, while Myra stared right back, equally thrown off by his outburst. Dino kept staring, daydreaming that if he won the Sword Festival, he'd rocket into the spotlight and have girls lining up for him. As he lost himself in his thoughts, he spotted Alberto turning to leave and shouted, asking if he'd be taking part in the Sword Festival. Alberto only gave a lazy, non-committal sound back. He faced Alberto head-on, bold as brass, and said it was obvious Alberto would come for him in the upcoming festival. Only Alberto seemed miles away, staring at a brand-new smirking student who was laughing and daring him to admit he'd really skip it. Alberto stayed silent, but his thoughts raced. Who on earth was this new, confident kid? Moments later, Dino bolted in sheer panic, scrambling away and abandoning his bag behind, his face twisted with pure fear. Alberto stayed put, staring at the ground like a silent witness to Dino's sudden escape. Dino crumpled to his knees, totally dumbfounded, sputtering that he couldn't fathom how a student could be like that, while the smirking guy just said the Sword Festival couldn't get any better, his voice dripping with something unsettling. A whole week blasted by and the grand arena finally stood roaring with anticipation. Then a thunderous voice echoed out, welcoming everyone to the big, long-awaited event. The festival hit its final day, and the whole air buzzed with pure anticipation for the big main event everyone's been waiting for. Alberto stood with the other students, right beside that smirking guy and this brand-new cloaked stranger, all of them holding their breath for their turn. As he waited, Alberto's focus snagged on a faint, familiar voice, and when the sound hit, he realized he'd heard it before, ripping a long-buried memory back to life. High above the roaring crowd, King Castrol von Vischudel's ruler, stared down from a private box, turning the festival into something heavy, sacred, and impossible to ignore. Down in the arena, a bubbly host in a bunny suit bounced onto the scene and blasted the opening ceremony to life, her voice ringing with pure excitement. Then she shouted that the contestants were finally ready to march in. And with that cue, Alberto, the smirking student, along with the cloaked figure and 2 fresh contestants, marched into the grand arena, ready to take on whatever came next, and Alberto lifted his hand to the crowd like he was owning the moment. Rosie, the spunky bunny girl host, bounced up to Alberto and teased him about whether he'd been watching her. Then she declared he was incredibly cute, and Alberto's face instantly exploded into an angry blush as he tried to deny he knew her, even while she kept locking eyes on him. Rosie, she clearly knew him way too well, and she promised she'd back him all the way in what's coming next. Meanwhile, King Castrol Vishudel stepped before the students of Wendestal Academy and thanked them for showing up at the Sword Festival. Then he teased that the preliminary rounds were about to begin, but first, he had to bring out some special guests. Next, he dragged out the first guest, the famous mage Marlin from the nation of Gross, right before the big, intimidating Knight Gross. Marlin flicked his flourish like a showman and blurted that he'd never seen the legendary 7 heroes in person, gushing hardest over Lady Marlin's goddess-level beauty. But Rosie the bunny girl cut in fast, reminding him everyone in the room could hear him patting his own back. Rosie, still doing her job, asked Marlon what he thought about the upcoming Sword Festival. He only smirked and shut her down, saying all he cared about was Platkin. The crowd erupted anyway, and students including Rosie shouted Platin like it was gospel, while Alberto just stood there, confused out of his mind, wondering why Gross had suddenly brought him up and what all this attention was really about. That sudden spotlight pinned Alberto to the spot. His smile came out wrong, sweat beading on his brow as Dino and the mysterious student watched his discomfort from right nearby. That mysterious student shot Alberto a quick look, then jerked his head away with clear irritation, grumbling that musclehead Marlon must have said something to set off all this chaos. Dino watched Alberto like a hawk, wondering why his friend was suddenly drawing so much attention, and if he was being downright foolish. Alberto, drowning in his own thoughts, couldn't tell if he was just nervous, or if everyone actually expected him to win and blow up into popularity, a terrifying idea that still felt dangerously exciting. Towering over the festival stood a massive statue of the one-eyed warrior, Sword Saint Alpha, built to honor her legend and crown the nation's strongest student. King Castrol Vashidel didn't waste a second. Standing before the cheering crowd, he slammed the Sword Festival Battle Tournament wide open, kicking off the brutal competition for everyone to see. He fixed his sights ahead with unwavering determination, and the moment the Sword Festival kicked off, his calm, unshakable resolve burned in his eyes. Then he shot his focus up to the young woman on the balcony and silently promised her, "Marie, I'll definitely win, just watch me." She stared back with a steady, serious expression that never wavered. Later, in a waiting room, he stared ahead and counted the hours, preliminaries first, and the main tournament wouldn't kick off until the afternoon, while the massive arena, where the early matches would explode, sprawled out in front of him. On the arena floor, the preliminaries were blazing, hundreds of fighters packed into groups of 10 or more, while the rules stayed dead simple. He kept his eyes locked on everything, realizing that if anyone got knocked off the stage or couldn't fight anymore, they'd be disqualified, so only one fighter from each group could push through to the main tournament. He let out a quiet chuckle, already knowing this process would drag on forever, especially with how legendary their school was. Then boom, an announcer's voice thundered that the first match was over. Just as he finally sat back down, he snapped his head up in pure shock. She stood there triumphant while her opponent lay defeated, no question left. He stared and it hit him all at once. He'd expected Carol to be strong, but he never saw this coming. She crushed the fight without even firing a single spell. Her power was so far beyond what he'd guessed it didn't just surprise him, it blew his expectations apart. The bunny girl host snapped the event open with the first match, a full-blown speed contest, calling it a clash between Dastoria's princesses and dropping the name Roger. Alberto leaned in, eyes locked on every move as the action kicked off. Alberto couldn't stop thinking about the Princess of Dastoria, and up in the stands the other students buzzed about the tournament. Sure, they expected him to win, but it's suddenly wilder than anyone predicted, so Alberto knew he had to stay razor-sharp and vigilant. Moments later, the bunny girl host's booming voice snapped the air again, calling out the second match and the player's entrance. Dino beside Alberto froze with a startled look, then Alberto shot him a quick glance, curiosity flickering in his eyes. Dino's shock hit like a wave, his face twisted in pure disbelief, sweat pouring down his brow, while Alberto, still totally lost, stared at his friend's wild breakdown, desperate to figure what could have caused that kind of panic. Elsewhere, the succubus demon couldn't contain her excitement with Myra, dying to see Platon in action, while Myra just smirked because Marlon was still dead asleep, totally clueless as everything kicked off. Alberto planted himself on the arena floor, scanning every qualifier like a hunter, and noticing that only Dino felt familiar. Sure, the prelims were doable, but one gut worry kept gnawing at him, unspoken, and with that weight on his chest, he finally stood tall and declared he was ready. The bunny girl host's voice sliced through the air and boom, the match was on. Right then, Roger exploded forward with a lightning-fast, ruthless strike, catching Alberto totally off guard as surprise snapped across his face, while the bunny girl host blurted a warning, realizing Alberto's real instincts were finally starting to surface. Roger kept smashing forward, blasting out a non-stop storm of raw magic, so much power it left Dino and the rest of the crowd staring in pure disbelief, while Alberto braced himself with wide eyes as that crushing spell came screaming straight for him. Roger flashed a smirk and shot his hand out like an invitation, daring Alberto to grab it. Then Dino saw the trap and screamed that Roger was a fool. Alberto, still reeling from the last beatdown, tried to recover and got slammed by Roger's next move, flying through the air and crashing hard. Roger wore that cocky smirk and bragged that his attack was crushing, then wondered, could he take on even more opponents at once? At the same time, the panicked bunny girl host shouted that an energy bomb was forming as a colossal sphere of magic energy swallowed Alberto whole, leaving him fully trapped. Still stuck inside that energy sphere, he couldn't help it. Confidence lit up his face as Roger, his opponent, clocked him as an academy kid and warned him, the energy bomb, a fourth-tier spell, would detonate the second it touched him. Alberto didn't even flinch. He said that kind of attack was nothing at all. As Roger thrust his hand out, the energy bomb snapped into a solid form, throbbing with dangerous power, and Alberto stared at it, eyes sharp, half locked in focus, half stunned like he just spotted a masterpiece of magic. Moments later, the energy bomb detonated, and it was Alberto's doom. Roger jerked back in pure shock, insisting his strike had definitely landed, while Alberto strolled away from the blast wearing a smug grin and saying he'd turned the bomb's own power into a magic barrier straight between his hands to deflect it. As the threat wiped out, he declared that only he and Roger were left. After shutting down Roger's attack, Alberto snapped his eyes toward the stance, grinned like trouble, and shouted at Dino to hurry over. Dino jolted at the sound, staring back in shock, wondering if Alberto really meant him. With a cocky grin, Alberto fired off a challenge, demanding to know what was wrong and pushing his opponent to step up and face him. Dino stared at Alberto with a stone-cold face, and inside his head he realized this wasn't the Dino-san he'd known. Two fighters faced off in a massive arena, and then it hit, only they two were left standing. Alberto launched into a lightning-fast sword clash, ducking a brutal strike at the last second, then watched his opponent move with unreal agility, because whoever this was, they didn't feel anything like the Dino he knew. Dino's eyes blew wide with pure shock as the fight's intensity kept cranking higher and higher. Two warriors crashed into each other, their blades locking with a brutal, ringing smack that tore through the whole arena. Dino flashed a huge, confident grin and basically laughed at the idea that he was Dino, practically declaring, "Yeah, it's me," with a smug, triumphant attitude. He kept that smug smirk on his face, then Alberto, thrown off by the sudden spike in power, finally clocked him and shouted, "Dino Schultzer, is that you?" Alberto got shoved down to one knee, his sword clattering to the ground, while Dino loomed over him like a champion who'd already won. He stared at Dino, baffled because the guy looked like his usual, quiet self again, and Dino shot back that nobody had even given him a real, proper greeting. Still stunned by that jaw-dropping burst of power, Alberto snapped, demanding to know where the real Dino was, the one he knew existed. Powerful Dino just smirked, cold and unsettling, and his silence hit harder than Alberto's desperate begging. Then he exploded forward and slammed Alberto with a brutal, lightning-fast strike, cutting him off to say he didn't need answers, because Alberto was about to die. Alberto wore a grim face when it clicked. The tournament wasn't a test at all, it was a warning shot for something much darker, and just as he understood it, he barely dodged another lightning-fast strike as the blade screamed past his head. Even with Alberto fighting back, Dino's assault wouldn't let up. He got shoved back again and again by sheer, crushing force. That relentless pressure crushed Alberto to his knees, scraping him hard across the ground, and Dino, grinning like a nightmare, declared Alberto would never beat him, not matter who Alberto really was. Dino's smile stretched into a terrifying, almost demonic grin, and raw killing intent poured off him. Alberto stared up, feeling that murderous aura hit like a wave, and Dino just shrugged, saying that if this were a fair fight, Alberto might actually have a shot. Alberto, soaked in sweat, couldn't even process Dino's words, because with that insane burst of power on display right now, what else could it possibly mean? Drenched in defeat, Alberto crumpled to the ground, eyes staring and unblinking as his whole body shook uncontrollably, while Dino loomed over him like a silent, ruthless champion. Out in the distance, the mysterious student watched it all, and from a higher perch, the gross night kept its cold attention on the scene. As the battle's wreckage finally quieted, Myra's face turned grim. She grabbed the little sleeping child and shouted for them to wake up, because if they stayed out cold, death would come, and right beside them, another figure stood shaking with fear. Meanwhile, the bunny girl host stared at him, worry cracking her voice as she shouted for Platsama, while Alberto's face twisted in agony and confusion, stumbling through the chaos like he couldn't believe what was happening to him. Alberto slumped and strained, and then above him came a mocking voice. His opponent, a student with spiky light brown hair, loomed over him with a smirk, asking if the poison was finally starting to bite. The smirking student finally dropped the mask, confessing he'd poisoned Alberto's sword with a dragon-sealing toxin. Furious it had taken this long to bite, Alberto's eyes went wide with shock as his body started to collapse under the deadly poison, and the crowd nearby panicked. While the bunny girl host blurted out that Alberto had just collapsed and begged for answers about his condition, the spiky-haired student snapped back with furious defiance, saying tournament rules let someone use up to 3 magic items, and Myra, watching it all unfold, started wondering if poison, especially poison that could knock an opponent down, really counted as allowed. With a sinister smirk, he only licked his lips and dodged the question, while Myra's face stayed set in seriousness as she kept wrestling with what it all really meant. Could poison magic that leaves someone unable to fight even be considered okay? Alberto groaned as he tried to shove himself upright, his body weighing him down and refusing to move while his opponent closed in, sneering at his weakness. Yet as poison burned through his veins, his eyes locked in with fresh, unbreakable resolve. The spiky-haired student slammed in a brutal punch, dropping Alberto back onto the ground again, and the bunny girl host gasped in pure horror, hand flying to her mouth, while that mysterious student just stared at the violence with an ice-cold, emotionless look. Bruised and bleeding, Alberto coughed weakly, and a brutal truth hit him like a truck. Only an opponent like this, with that cruel, dirty tactic, would dare to unleash such a deadly poison. Suddenly, the spiky-haired student's whole attitude flipped. Rage twisted his face as he boomed that he was the younger brother of werewolf Lord Alberto, the one he'd killed, and he'd come to tear through the pain by avenging his brother's death. Alberto stayed on the ground, swallowing the revelation with a quiet, pained, "Is that so?" But his opponent wouldn't let it go. Rage surged. He snapped at Alberto, demanded why he wasn't fighting back, then drove a brutal kick into him. A raging student kept swinging, screaming at Alberto like, "How can you apologize when you're totally stuck?" He demanded to know if Alberto planned to die without fighting. Then, as fists hammered down, Alberto, bruised and barely moving, snapped into a shocking realization about the attacker. Rage blazing through him, his attacker screamed that his brother was born to rise as the Demon Lord and march the Demon King's army into war. He kept firing off his rant, praising his brother's strength, then snapped his eyes to Alberto and spat that he was a villain, even pointing out how eerily their magical auras matched. Alberto, still wrecked from the poison and the beating, could only freeze and stare back in stunned silence. He struggled to even get what the accusation meant, his mind sprinting as he kept asking himself if he really looked like the monster who caused all that pain, because that thought wouldn't stop haunting his poisoned head. His attacker, thirsting for revenge, burst forward and gripped a small, razor-sharp blade that flashed in the light, ready to end Alberto for good, and with rage in his throat, he screamed that Alberto would never be forgiven and demanded he die. Right before the blade could land, the rival student got yanked into shimmering magical chains, and his rage-crazed strike died on the spot. Meanwhile, the succubus demon watched from the sidelines, coldly saying excuses won't save anyone. Alberto crumpled on the ground with his eyes shut, a soft, otherworldly glow circling him as the truth hit inside his head. "Even if I'm forgiven, I don't think I'll ever be able to forgive myself." Alberto's eyes snapped open with a ferocious jolt. Pain and confusion got bulldozed by pure determination, and he swore he wasn't dying here, his spirit going iron-hard as he braced to take on his still-bound attacker. Alberto just stared in disbelief as a brutal duel erupted in the arena right in front of him. He instantly recognized one fighter, but the other's arrival hit him like a total shock. Alberto stormed up to the rival student and demanded answers, but the kid only smirked, then pulled a tiny, dark thing from his jacket, shocking Alberto so hard he blurted that it was impossible. Meanwhile, the bunny girl host stared in shock at the poison, and Myra, watching it all, cut in to explain that magic items were usually allowed, but anything with a direct, instant effect was banned on the spot. Alberto, listening nearby, snapped to the truth that it really was a magic artifact. The rival student started laying out his plan and spilled a whole stash of tools, mostly things he'd use to boost his magic attack or toughen his defenses, but this time he picked gear made to shut down abnormal status effects. Even with the power gap, he shrugged and admitted those preparations still weren't a total waste. He tugged his scarf into place with a confident grin, practically bragging that even though it was cheap, it still took forever to kick in. In the crowd, Dino leaned in and told Marie and Carol this: those weird status effects don't care how strong you are, and they can wreck you, so taking precautions is totally understandable. Alberto snapped out in pure frustration, finally seeing just how vicious the rival's mind really was, and then the rival's student just smirked coldly, saying the match was already over. With that declaration, the rival student drove a brutal punch straight into Alberto's stomach, and Alberto gasped, then coughed up blood. The rival student loomed over Alberto's fallen body, grinning like he'd won it all. Then the bunny girl host's booming voice declared Alberto the loser and made the arena erupt. In the crowd, the mysterious student and his crew kept their eyes locked, and the female student looked downright stunned by what she just witnessed. The succubus demon stared on, worried sick, as the victorious rival student scooped up unconscious Alberto and hauled him away, and then she said she had something crucial to ask him. With Alberto unconscious in his arms, he slipped out of the arena with a sly smirk, while his beast-like tail whipped behind him. As he moved, a sick wave of dread crashed over him. His transformation magic, the very thing that kept his beastly form locked in place, was starting to unravel. The announcer's booming voice cut through the chaos. Now for an interview with the victor, player Plath. Still gripping Alberto, Plath's face tightened more and more as the magic drained away, step by brutal step, and in the distance, the bunny girl host stared, shocked to her core. The arena crowd exploded into deafening cheers and wild shouts, arms shooting into the air as pure excitement took over, completely blind to the magical anomaly about to break everything wide open. In the crowd, Dino, now rocking wolf ears and a tail, was throwing a fit at the succubus, furious that they called him a wolf, and screaming that the demon race's cheating charge was totally unfair, demanding to know why this chaos had erupted again. He kept pushing his heartfelt plea, telling her he'd been trying to evolve into a wolf and that he was done getting treated unfairly, and the succubus just listened with a calm, sly smirk. Moments later, Dino blinked and he was suddenly in a strange new place, still half-transformed, staring around in pure confusion as he shouted, "Where is this?" Flat stood before him in the stillness of a graveyard, telling him they were inside the royal palace grounds and that no danger was waiting right now. With a grim face, Platt snapped his attention to Dino and demanded he lay out everything he knew about Rionetta, leaving Dino staring in shock. Alberto's eyes went huge, and one chilling word snapped into his mind: graveyard. He found himself face to face with a grave, staring at a fox-eared student with a tail who demanded answers about what happened to the arena, and right as panic sparked in the kid's eyes, Alberto stayed cool, told him to calm down, and said he'd dragged him here for a very specific reason, even as the student kept snapping. "So what's that reason?" The terrified and furious fox-eared student grabbed Alberto by the collar, shaking as he demanded to know if Alberto was about to be executed. And even with the chaos rising, Alberto stayed calm, repeating that he needed him to calm down. He flashed a calm, reassuring smile and told the fox-eared student, "If you've still got the energy to come at me, then I'll be just fine." Still stunned, the fox-eared student shoved the matter further, demanding to know how Alberto knew the name of that witch and why he was really there in his ruined, lonely place. Alberto only nodded and answered his questions. Alberto then pointed right at the grave, urging the fox-eared student to stare closely, and told him, "This is exactly what I've been trying to show you." The fox-eared student locked eyes on the tombstone, and dread crashed through him when he understood it was his brother's grave. Alberto broke the silence, saying he'd buried him, then coldly told the fox-eared student he could do whatever he wanted in the human world now, because none of it mattered to him anymore. Overwhelmed, the fox-eared student snapped why his brother had been hanged like a monster. Then the grave's unmistakable, chilling stench hit him and proved he wasn't imagining it. Alberto told them the fox-eared student's brother really tore through the town, hurting everyone, and he'd finally been brought down, though Alberto insisted that smashing the town was never his real goal. The fox-eared student snapped his gaze upward, stunned, and demanded to know if it really wasn't his brother's doing. Alberto then guessed his brother must have been trapped under a confusion spell, and he admitted the same mind-bending magic had hit the fox-eared student too. Alberto's bombshell hit him hard, confusion magic, and the words kept rattling in his head like a warning he couldn't ignore. Could that really be her? He pictured his brother, beastkin and unstoppable, tearing through town before dying, and he knew he'd buried him here, something he'd started regretting the moment the truth sank in. Then the memory twisted tighter, his brother's final plea to be careful, and that earlier run-in with Alberto and a woman named Leonetta, right before his brother vanished. Leonetta flashed that sweet, unforgettable smile in his memory, like she was daring someone to stay on guard. Then it hit him. He and his brother stood there completely stunned while Leonetta watched them like she already knew something was off, and right after that moment, he finally realized they both started acting weird. Snapping back into the moment, the fox-eared student spun around and marched away with a grim face. Alberto watched him vanish, worry written all over him, as the student demanded, "Where are you going?" The fox-eared student said he got what Alberto meant, but he still refused to forgive. Then Alberto, with his eyes on Leonetta, asked straight out if he planned to meet her. Rage twisted his fox-eared face as he declared that, first and foremost, he'd hunt that woman. Only after she was dealt with would he shift his focus to guys like Platt and Vishutal. Alberto lifted his hand, then stopped him cold. "Hold up," he cut in. "I'm not done yet, I still have more to say." The fox-eared student clicked his tongue, his patience snapping. "What is it?" he demanded. Alberto flashed a small grin and leaned in. "Why don't we team up? I've got a proposal." A fox-eared student gasped in shock. Then, after agreeing to team up, he interrogated him, and the guy nodded hard. "And you know Leonetta?" Alberto said, his eyes darkening. "Yeah, she's my nemesis, straight from another world." He stared at this wild mess, wondering if he'd finally snapped into a dream, and Alberto, grinning like he already knew, told him straight that he was absolutely familiar with Leonetta. Alberto kept going, telling him how Leonetta had shoved him into that fight, and now he finally realized it was a lie. Then he blurted out, shaking with urgency, asking if the fox-eared student had a way to reach someone important. The student just stared off, clearly stuck in his own thoughts, and didn't answer right away, so Alberto snapped, "Hey, are you hearing me?" With a smug grin, he announced he was going straight for the biggest death flag he could find, and Alberto froze so hard he could only blurt out, "Why?" Still buzzing with energy, he suddenly snapped to a terrifying thought: where was Dino, and had they killed him? Platt wasted no time, telling Alberto to tear into the Academy's first warehouse right away. Meanwhile, the bunny girl host, still smiling like nobody else, kicked off the third match's next round and teased how hyped she was for Platt's upcoming performance, while Leonetta sat nearby, watching it all unfold with a cool, steady calm. Leonetta stayed seated and blurted, "Where did Platt go?" Myra stood right next to her and snapped back that both Platt and Gross were out for personal reasons, leaving Leonetta shocked because she'd never expected Gross to vanish too. Myra snapped her gaze to Leonetta and asked, "If I win the Sword Dance Festival, will you reconsider our engagement?" And the moment those words hit, Leonetta's face went completely stunned. Leonetta stays seated, staring into the distance with a pensive look, while Myra, somehow more whimsical, seems to be weighing a whole other important thought. Outside the arena, the sky suddenly soured, dark clouds slammed in like a warning, and the whole world felt the weather turn fast. A cold, terrifying aura crashed into the arena, then the name *Nightmare Mirage* hit like a warning siren. Out stepped a mysterious woman with long dark hair and a wicked grin, and the second she lifted her hand, dark, star-like blasts started raining down on everyone in sight, sparking instant panic across the crowd. In the stands, three men snapped into panic. One demanded what that sudden, blinding flare meant, another stared in disbelief at the silence, and the third wondered if it was some twisted part of the tournament show. Chaos exploded, and a bald man snapped at another observer, furious that he'd crashed into him earlier and never apologized. while Alberto, trapped in the swirl of confusion, stared there dumbfounded, trying to figure out what in the world was happening. He watched the arena explode into chaos, spectators screaming and scrambling, while an urgent announcement blasted over the crowd, confirming a riot was already tearing things apart, pointing to a magical attack from an unknown source and warning everyone. Some people were getting hit. Meanwhile, the mysterious woman, the nightmare mirage demon, drank in the chaos with a sinister grin, and she swore this was the start of a splendid show, because she just felt a massive surge of magic blasting in from outside. She leaned toward the bunny girl host and Myra, her voice dripping with dark amusement, and asked if they should round everyone up fast to revive the Demon King, laughing off the host's shock that all this chaos had spun so suddenly. Her eyes snapped to Lionetta, the female student, as she toyed with the perfect setup the situation handed them. Excellent bait. Then she promised them the tent was sealed behind a barrier, so she was safe, and she swore she wouldn't let anyone who messed with good people get away with it, hinting that the real target was the whole populace. Then she dropped the bombshell. She knew Leonetta's real identity, the fact she's one of the 7 heroes, and with a cold, chilling grin, she said her countermeasures were already locked in as Shadow Hunt. As she spoke, a hooded assassin slipped out of the dark behind Leonetta, yanked her up tight, and clamped a hand over her mouth to cut her off. Leonetta thrashed, eyes bulging with terror, fighting to scream as they bound her. Panic detonated through the arena as the bunny girl host screamed, frantic about where Lady Sarah had vanished, while the announcer's booming voice snapped out a royal warning. An unknown force had unleashed a brutal magic attack, and every student had to stand by immediately. Our apprentice stayed locked in, eyes sharp, worry burning across her face. Elsewhere, the nightmare mirage demon smirked like she owned the dark, her eyes blazing with cruel delight as she thought, with the troublesome 7 heroes gone, nothing else even matters. Back in the arena, the announcer official cranked up his voice and unveiled a demon general from the Demon King's army, here to steal the spotlight and put on a show. The bunny girl host shrieked and screamed for everyone to run, while King Castral the Chuttle just watched the floating, cloaked figure like it was royalty come calling. Rosk Knight and Carol Fighter followed the chaos as it erupted in front of them. The nightmare mirage demon then turned straight to King Castral, vowing she'd toss in even her tiny bit of strength to the Demon King's army, especially for a festival this massive. Castral listened, and his face gave away nothing. King Castral's calm snapped like a whip, his face twisted with fury as he barked, demanding to know why a demon general showed up at this critical moment, and where Alberto, Platt, and the other 7 heroes had vanished to. The nightmare mirage demon strutted into the arena on her high-heeled boots, stomping a scrap of debris flat, then sneered that she'd shut down any interference from that dull master. With tension cracking the air, Carol Fighters surged forward, fire in her eyes as she yanked her sword free and promised the king she'd take care of it, bringing up Princess Hysteria like a name that cuts fear in half. Nightmare mirage demon stared her down, a smirk playing across her face. The nightmare mirage demon stared down at Carol with pure disdain, then brushed her off as a nobody, just a tiny speck that couldn't possibly mess with her plans. The nightmare mirage demon kept taunting Carol, its grin stretching wider and wider, and Carol just clenched her jaw, rage simmering under her skin. Carol finally snapped, sprinting forward with a battle cry like she'd been saving that fury for this moment. Then the nightmare mirage demon dodged her with ease and flicked a hand out, summoning a swarm of shadow blades around her while sneering, "Aw, look at you, cute little kitten." She shot her arm out, a sinister grin curling her lips as she summoned a storm of shadowy, phantom blades. Shadow Dagger, the nightmare mirage demon, declared it, then blasted the attack forward. Carol Fighter jerked back with a gasp, eyes bulging as those shadowy daggers came flying at her. She darted and swerved to dodge the barrage, but there were too many blades and every strike hit with brutal precision. The dagger slammed home, shredding her defenses as pain ripped out of her. She gasped, dropped hard to the ground, and the truth hit like a wave. The demon's power was terrifyingly huge. Damn it, she clenched her teeth and fought through the agony. The nightmare mirage demon watched Carol tumble with a cold little grin like, "Oh wow, your father's really something, isn't he?" And she practically savored the jab, comparing Carol's mess right now to a past enemy that was way more terrifying. Watching her, the floating demon general snarled and rolled a dark orb of energy into his palm, thinking she'd really dare to face his demonic power, and then he roared, voice shaking with brute might, ready to smash her with the final, crushing blow. The demon general's brutal strike slammed into Carol Fighter and detonated like thunder across the arena, the shockwaves ripping through everything, so devastating that there was zero question how deadly that hit truly was. That brutal blast dropped Carol Fighter on the ground, motionless and shattered, and from the stands everyone stared in terror as Leonetic gasped, "No way," while the king and the bunny girl host froze in stunned disbelief. Then the crowd erupted with a single Carol-sama. Pure concern poured out. Carol, a young woman, was crumpled face down on the ground, clearly hurt, while someone in the crowd shouted her name in panic. She fought to push herself up, her face twisting in agony and stunned disbelief because she finally saw it, just how massive the power gap was between her and the demon general, a difference so unbelievable it almost broke her brain. While chaos roared all around, a stern commander snapped into action, ordering his men to evacuate the civilians, then to call Platt and Albert for immediate help for the injured, because he knew too well that many would be writhing in broken bones, trapped and unable to move. Then a messenger burst in with terrible news. Every inch of the royal capital was in chaos, and there wasn't a single safe place left to evacuate to. From her perch, the demon general grinned, proving the chaos wasn't just in the arena, it had swallowed the entire royal capital. The commander's eyes went wide with pure horror, because what he was watching was magic on a scale so massive he couldn't even process it, something he'd never seen in his life. Elsewhere, Carol got yanked onto a stretcher and rushed along by two attendants, her body still writhing with pain as she fought to stay awake, groaning through every jolt. While everyone panicked, the demon general didn't even blink. She brushed off the chaos as illusion magic, ordered her troops to hold their ground, and told them to wait until the spell's effects finally faded. She snapped her eyes to the commander, a sly little smile curling her lips as she challenged him. Did he really think this was all she had up her sleeve? The commander, completely thrown off, demanded what she meant. Then she just shrugged and said that for a festival as massive as this, that wouldn't even come close. She claimed the demon army's main force had been sitting right outside the royal capital in the Murren Forest, and that it was no big deal, because pretty soon they'd all flood into the capital like a wave. Hearing that, the commander snapped into shock, blurted that the Murren Forest was right nearby, and his subordinate rushed in, shouting that every soldier had already been sent to the city. She burst into a triumphant laugh, then wondered, without her 7 heroes standing guard and with the capital in full chaos, did this nation really have what it takes to stop her and the demon army? Meanwhile, the commander snapped his fist on a balcony, stewing in pure frustration and spitting curses under his breath, while the young noblewoman Marie stood nearby and stared out over the roaring chaos of the city. She couldn't shake the dread that the kingdom was collapsing, and even right here was too dangerous. Down below, the commoner's frantic screams ripped through the air, begging her name like it was the last lifeline she had to save. Right then, a heavy-set nobleman slid up to Marie with a glass of wine in hand, his unsettling stare pinning her in place. Then he demanded to know if she'd been there the whole time, and it sent a jolt through her. Marie's breath caught as she realized even the VIP nobles were spellbound with magic. Then the man chuckled, admired her up close, and yanked her arms so hard she screamed. From afar, the commander caught sight of her and admitted quietly to himself that the moment he saw her that night, he'd been craving to do awful things and he couldn't believe she was still alive, while Marie realized his intentions were nothing but shallow masks. Still clutching Marie, the nobleman snapped that the VIP seats were protected by a defensive barrier, but if anyone on the outside ever tried to cross it, they'd be wiped out instantly. Marie snapped her gaze aside and dread hit like a wave. Anyone the magic didn't touch at first was being infected at a breakneck pace. She thrashed against the nobleman's grip, her face twisting in pure panic as he dragged her in close, choking down her protests with a hand over her mouth, demanding a kiss while he flat-out refused to listen to her muffled pleas to stop. With pure defiance, she yanked free, eyes blazing. Marie declared herself the fiancée of Blatt von Bichtel, swearing she'd never let him claim her as property. The nobleman's lecherous grin died in his face, snapping into pure shock at her words. Right then, a swift dark figure sliced into view from the side. A brutal punch landed clean on the nobleman's face, and the impact sent him crashing backward with a sickening crunch, blood spraying as he got knocked out hard. Marie, pinned to the floor, snapped her eyes up in shock as a young man loomed over the nobleman who couldn't move. Then he gave her a calm, solid promise. She was safe now. Blatt whipped around to Marie with a relieved grin, mumbled an apology for being late, and checked, "Are you okay?" Marie's eyes went wide with instant relief, and she could only squeak out a tiny, grateful sound. He shot his hand out toward her, offering help while she stayed on the floor, stunned and still trying to wrap her head around what just happened. Marie clung to Blatt with all her strength, shoved her face into his chest, and finally let the tears rip as she admitted just how terrified she'd been. Blatt pulled her into his arms, and a grim look hardened his face. He admitted they'd been standing on the edge of disaster, because if his preparations slipped even a single moment, it could have ended way worse. His fist clenched tight, and it still trembled. He brushed Marie's head with a gentle pat, murmuring that everything would be okay and that she should trust him with the rest, and Marie looked up at him, a shy blush creeping across her cheeks. Weeks later, she spun around with a shocked, flustered look as he kept right on gently patting her head. Moments later, Marie, calm again, dropped into a deep bow to Blatt, thanking him for his help and insisting she was okay before leaving the rest to everyone else. He just stood nearby, watching her with a flat, unreadable face. He just nodded, confirming he'd caught every word. Marie, still looking a little shy, snapped her gaze away. Suddenly, Blatt hopped onto the nearby railing and winked, teasing Marie that if she kissed his cheek, he'd be reignited. Marie's face went scarlet as she snapped back, furious, demanding to know why he was messing around at a moment this critical. He leaned in with a smug, confident grin and told Marie straight up that calling off an engagement wasn't some casual thing, and that keeping the tournament going was looking rough. Then he urged them to grab a different shot, and Marie just stared back with a small smile, clocking him for the same selfish act all over again. Meanwhile, the commander's worry spiked as he asked whether the voice he'd heard was really Blatt. Then he quickly apologized, and there was Blatt, crouched low with his eyes locked on the ground. He looked up, flashed that confident grin, and told the commander it was nothing, then dared him to hand the rest to him. The commander visibly exhaled, then watched his black steed leap off the railing in a smooth arc, dropping straight into the arena below. From the top of a towering wall, the demon general stared down at Blatt, who stood waiting in the arena, and she snapped that Blatt von Bichtel was late. Blatt locked eyes with her and refused to flinch, determination blazing on his face. He stood toe-to-toe with the demon general, who snapped that the show had already started without him, because he was late. Blatt just grinned and said it was a real honor that she'd waited for him even a little, calling her the marionette princess. Standing in the arena, the commander up above rattled on about a light-mouthed general and how the capital was sliding straight into chaos, while Marie watched with a heavy heart. Blatt burned with reflections on his own nature, admitted he genuinely liked helping people, and that confession made the commander press him hard on what he planned to do next. He heard the commander's question and felt the thought spark inside him, "No, it can't be." With a soft, steady nod, "That's right," he turned his back on the confrontation and started walking away. His sudden retreat blindsided Marie, the nobleman, and Carol, and their faces twisted with raw, total disbelief. With everyone stunned, the demon general burst into a bone-chilling laugh, saying the moment the Holy Mother was sealed, nothing could save their world. Then she snapped that her enemies finally got it, and she had zero patience left. "We've now finished this fast." Carol watched, her heart aching as Black chewed on the demon general's words, one question clawing at him. "There are things that can't be saved, right?" The demon general just kept a cold, unblinking stare, waiting for Black to answer. Then he snapped out his verdict. There was nothing he could do, not a thing, because he couldn't save it. And behind him, the demon general loomed in the shadows, dark and terrifying, like doom refusing to move. As the commander stared on and Marie begged for help, Blatt suddenly flashed a huge grin and declared, full of certainty, "The one who saves, it's not me." The demon general recoiled in shock at his words. Right in the middle of the arena, Marie got swallowed by a blinding, radiant light glowing like pure, ethereal power had locked onto her in an instant. The demon general froze on the spot, eyes bulging with pure shock, then let out a sharp gasp as Marie's sudden transformation hit her right in the face. When her transformation wrapped up, the whole arena erupted in confusion, and Blatt just stared like something didn't add up. Nearby, a commoner lost it, shouting in frustration as he thrust his fist up, utterly bewildered. Panic hit the crowd like lightning, murmurs tore through them as people scrambled, stunned and asking, "What did we do? Where are we?" And for some reason nobody could explain, they suddenly wanted to apologize to the people they loved, like a vital memory had been wiped clean. In the middle of all that chaos, the demon general gaped in pure disbelief, like his mind couldn't keep up with what was happening, while Marie stayed radiant and calm, a soft smile on her lips as she confidently said healing was nothing, because yeah, she was a goddess. A young woman in bunny ears stared in total disbelief, eyes wide as she tried to make sense of what was happening, and right beside her, another bunny-eared woman kept her back turned, visibly shaken by everything that was going down. With the chaos roaring on, Marie burst in, flashed a knowing smile at the demon general, and demanded why she'd shown up, while the demon general snapped back with lethal fury because she wasn't just a stranger. Marie was the Holy Mother of Salvation. Rage burned hotter in the demon general as she snapped that she sealed the thing away in another dimension moments ago. Then, right in front of her, the shadowy figure appeared anyway, grinning and chuckling like it was all a joke. The shadowy entity kept throwing taunts, openly laughing at the demon general like a total fool who'd been played, and the demon general jerked back, her face twisting in pure disbelief and shock. Then the entity tore off the mask and admitted it had forged a contract with the Great Darkness, ripping open a corridor too, something it bragged only a real demon lord could pull off, while the demon general just stood there, eyes bulging with pure horror at what it all meant. As it spoke, the shadowy thing started to crawl and twist in place, its shape sharpening into something darker and more terrifying, like it was stocking up on power the world wasn't ready for. Out of nowhere, the werewolf lord burst onto the scene, swaggering in and sneering at the demon general like he'd been tossed aside for good, and right beside him stood Blatt and Marie, grinning like they'd just sealed the deal, leaving the demon general frozen, begging to know why the hell they were there. Blatt, clearly fed up, cut down the shadowy thing, turning out to be Lionetta, and admitted he only half trusted the prince's words, but they were dead right because he just uncovered Lionetta's real face. The demon general froze in disbelief, seeing her whole scheme laid bare as if someone had yanked the curtain away. Black then confirmed it, telling her he'd been tipped off by a mystery source, and that's how he saw every move before she even made it. Marie stepped forward and laid out the plan. If they wanted to save Sarim, they needed Lionetta to become a shadow warrior, since the only known way to beat the demon general's illusion magic was her shadowy power. Lionetta, kneeling in the dark, seemed to accept the role without hesitation. He stared into the chaos and realized Lionetta had set the final quest in motion, right as a national upheaval was about to erupt, and he just had to rely on the fact they already had a countermeasure, because his own transformation power was suddenly feeling like their biggest weapon. His wild foresight blew everyone away. Marie beamed with a soft smile and praised him for reading the situation so far ahead. The noble man couldn't hide his shock, and Bunny Girl 1 stared at him with shining, adoring eyes, declaring him downright amazing. Meanwhile, the demon general, even with every move looking like it had been outplayed, kept that creepy smile locked on. She admitted her plan had been seen through, but shrugged it off like it was nothing. Then she leaned in and said the monsters were probably already waiting in the forest, because they'd lured the capital's citizens straight to them. While the werewolf lord and Blad watched, the demon general kept talking, spilling her real plan: steal the people's bad emotions and bring the demon king back to life. Then she snapped her focus to Marie and demanded, "Tell me, do you really want this?" She leaned in and warned that the forest monsters wouldn't stand a chance against the capital's defenses, and that the magic stones from the capital were about to start flooding to her. With a smug, triumphant grin, the demon general shot her hand out and in that glowing cage exposed a tiny creature that shimmered like a living spark. The cage thing barely moves, its shape is smudged and unreadable behind the bars. Suddenly, the demon general's eyes bulged with shock, and confusion spilled out as one sharp syllable of disbelief slipped from her lips. A sharp asterisk crack tore through the air, and you could feel the sudden, brutal impact hit like a punch. Meanwhile, in the forest, the werewolf lords lounged like they owned the place, stretching out while they grumbled at the shockingly huge crowd of tiny monsters sitting there for him, because honestly, this whole thing was starting to feel downright exhausting. Then he tore loose with fire magic, blasting the creatures into ash with a roaring inferno. A tiny elf-looking witch in a pointed hat watched from the side, shocked by the demon general's ambush and stunned by how many enemies poured in. She snapped that she had to deal with all of them, calling them a bunch of idiots. With her hands held just slightly out, she stood there while the werewolf lord spun toward her, gripping that huge sword like it was nothing. Then he demanded answers about Corset and what the prince really was. She fought the urge to admit it, but inside she couldn't stop wondering, was he truly a child of man? Monstrous beasts unleashed bone-rattling roars, their bodies twisting with raw rage as they charged straight at them. His eyes sharpened, and a flash of resolve ignited inside those dark depths. With a sharp, decisive move, he seized the hilt of his massive sword and readied himself for the fight. He planted his feet, smirk curling at his lips, while a crushing, all-powerful territory snapped into place around him, like it was poised to strike the moment he decided. Moments later, a brutal, sweeping attack blasted out of him, ripping through the monsters and scattering them as debris rained down, and then he dropped to his knees, clearly spent from the strain. After the chaos of battle, he stumbled into a silent forest, and there, the elf who stood before him watched with an expression he couldn't read. She gripped her sword and said that even someone like him could take this with ease. Then she hit him with one hard question: was he really black? With a sly grin, he leaned in and admitted he didn't even have the answer fully figured out himself. A gentle breeze hissed through the far-off trees, like it was whispering a curious question into the night. With the conversation finally over, the arena went eerily quiet, as if the silence itself had swallowed everything. With a grim, emotionless stare, he pushed Lionetta, demanding she surrender to the unseen lion behind the curtain. The shadow entity raised a tiny, empty cage and snapped that her plan was totally ruined, because the magic stone had drained every last bit of human power. With a cold glare, the shadow entity called him out by his full name, Blatt von Bichtel, then pinned him down, barking for her real identity. He snapped his gaze aside, eyes dropping down like he was lost in thought, and that heavy, pensive look settled on his face. Moments later, in a huge circular arena, he stood by himself, stared up at a shadowy entity looming on a faraway wall, and started to speak. He flashed a tiny smile and said he wasn't chasing anything, he just wanted to dodge a death flag because he was only the prince of that one country. Her eyes went wide and pure fury twisted her face as his words finally clicked in. With a furious shriek, she hurled a shadow dagger volley at him, but he sidestepped every blade like it was nothing. Then she snapped that he was done messing around, that there was no time for games, and he stayed cool, telling her to listen first, swearing she'd regret not finishing him right then. She lunged in with her clawed hand aimed straight at his face, but he snapped his arm up and blocked her strike, twisting it away at the last second. They tore into each other in a blur, rocketing across the arena as every punch and kick screamed past their defenses. He kept dodging her brutal, furious strikes, and the shadow thing snapped, spitting with rage, begging to know why none of his hits ever landed. So he tried to talk her down, forcing her to listen as he swore he could still save her sister. Blatt shot forward with insane speed, replaying every move the fake queen had made so he could dodge her perfectly. Then he burst in close with a knife in hand, pressing his plea again and again, swearing he could save her sister if she'd just listen, and the shadow entity, caught off guard by how close he was, could only gasp in total disbelief. Blatt flashed a confident smile, told the noble man he was totally fine, and offered to handle it himself, only for the noble to stare, stunned, and demand if Blatt really meant it. Moments later, Blatt slammed into the face of the demon general, and she stared at him, stunned and lost, firing back. Why did he step in against her sister? Her face hardened, and a fierce, unspoken determination locked in behind her eyes. While rain pelted the street, a noble man stormed up to the demon general waiting outside a grand building, demanding to know who she really was, then snapped that she had the wrong place and that a crucial meeting was already underway. He kept up the act of caring about her in the pouring cold rain and urged her to rush home, then she managed a faint, creepy smile back. A sly smile tugged at her lips as she said, cool as thunder in the distance, "Yep, the rain was exactly why she'd come." His calm snapped like glass, his eyes bulged with raw disbelief as he sputtered, demanding to know if that's really what she just claimed. Without warning, she yanked him up by the collar and dragged him close, then spat out a cold sorry that froze his blood. She was acting on the king's reincarnation's direct orders and the Holy Rima Kingdom's leaders, and she made it clear. She was an agent of the nation of Rima. The nobleman's face twisted with pure terror. She whirled around and strode off while the nobleman's lifeless body lay sprawled across the blood-splattered floor. The Blinel family had served the Holy Rima Kingdom for generations as assassins, until one day, everything snapped. Later, in plain clothes, she swung open the door and told her father and mother she was home. Then, right behind it, a single foot sat still and ruined, like proof of what she'd done. She froze in place, eyes bulging with pure, gut-punching terror as her parents' bodies, mutilated and sprawled, sat dead on that fancy rug, and right over the chaos stood a soldier with his sword still up, staring down like the whole crime was his silent trophy. As the soldier barked to her, her father, gravely wounded but stubbornly holding on, pushed her to run, to save herself with Marie, his voice ragged and failing like a last lifeline as the massacre closed in around them. Meanwhile, this young girl with her long hair streaming stood there frozen too. Then her basket of freshly picked flowers slipped right out of her hands as the terrifying truth finally hit. Away from the massacre, a battle-scarred commander with a hard stare caught the runaway girl's identity. Arietta, Marie's sister, then barked orders, unleashing the hunt at once. Young Arietta, eyes wide, face twisted with pure terror, bolted through the halls, the brutal images of her parents' murders burning like fire behind her eyes. As she bolted, her younger sister Marie shouted after her, begging her to stop, and that's when the truth hit. The Blundell family, their bloodline, was called the Tailcutters, and the name practically promised a brutal fate. The commander kept going, spelling out how the once famous dark assassination ring dragged the world's hate onto the Remortal family just for sheltering those assassins, and now the kingdom was getting crushed under brutal pressure. In the end, the kingdoms caved to that roaring public backlash and chose the most brutal path, wiping out the entire Blundell family. Even with the chase still snapping at her heels, Arietta swore she'd finally slipped into safety, a tiny, hidden house by the sea miles from her pursuers. But that shelter didn't last. As she swung the door open, a warm voice inside greeted her, calling her big sister, and for one shocking second, everything felt normal again, right in the middle of her escape nightmare. Marie's little sister poured out her whole day with a bright laugh. No scary people showed up, and Arietta even cooked her favorite mushroom soup, so Arietta gave a soft smile and nodded along, confirming every word. Marie was still glowing, pushing her to eat fast, but then a close-up on Arietta snapped in, and that troubled stare said she wasn't laughing for real. Something heavy sat under her jokes. Right after they finally found shelter on a lonely peninsula, disaster struck. Arietta dropped to her knees beside Marie, who was lying motionless in bed, crushed by a brutal curse sent by the dark spirits. Marie was sealed inside a curse of endless sleep, swallowed by a pitch-black darkness she'd never crawl out of. The demon general sat there in deadly silence, eyes locked somewhere beyond reach, as she wrestled with fate's relentless march and wondered exactly how far it would drag her. She remembered that brutal stretch of time when she'd tried everything to wake Arietta, only for her sister's eyes to stay shut, until Beelzebub suddenly appeared and promised he could save her, but only if she agreed to cooperate with the Demon King's awakening. So she threw herself into the Demon King's army, and when Black grilled her, he demanded to know how she even knew about his sister, then admitted with pure exhaustion that he was sick of trusting people. He leaned in hard, demanding she admit it. Did she really trust the Demon King's army and Beelzebub, even with all those suspicions screaming in her head? She told him Beelzebub had chained her with sword oaths, brutal contract magic that could get her killed if she ever broke it, and the moment he heard that, he understood. She'd thrown her life on the line. With a steely look in his eyes, he swore that he'd take the same oath right there with her. She gasped in shock, staring at him like, "Why would you do this for my sister? She isn't even your blood." Out in the distance, the werewolf lord watched with wide eyes and burst out, "What in the world is Blatt thinking?" From her balcony, Marie leaned as far as she dared, straining to catch the distant talk, until only one sickening word slipped through the air: death. Blatt threw out a bold deal. He'd save her sister and she'd step away from the kingdom. Then he pressed her. Was that not a win for both of them? The demon general fixed her gaze on him, and as her eyes measured his wildly bold proposal, her face gave away nothing. Her razor-sharp gaze pinned him in place, and his unshaken eyes pinned her right back. Neither flinched, and a silent challenge roared between them. After wrestling with it for a beat, she finally gave in and agreed, saying the contract could be made and it wouldn't bother her at all, while he stared like, "Are you sure? You really think that won't be inconvenient?" He flashed a wide, almost childlike grin, bursting with thanks, while that tiny doll-like version of her sister Arietta just watched, eyes narrowed, clearly annoyed. The demon general flinched at his sudden reaction, stammering, and shoved him to start the ritual right now, while the little Arietta figure echoed her own frustration. Moments later, a tangled magic circle erupted into light under her feet, its runes spiraling with raw arcane power and signaling the start of some kind of. She thrust her hands up, yanking shimmering magical energy into the air until it finally hardened into something real. And as the ritual roared on, Blatt stared, fully aware she was unleashing ancient contract magic that meant business. With fierce determination blazing in her eyes, she poured that energy into the air, and a spectral sword snapped into existence, its blade humming with raw, unstoppable magic. The moment the sword hardened, Vlad shot his hand out and she met it, their fingers grazing as they geared up to lock in the pact. From a nearby doorway, Bunny Girl 1 stared in shock, eyes wide as the ritual unfolded. One razor-thin drop of blood slid off her fingertip and splashed onto the spectral blade, glowing as it hit. Then she pressed that finger to her lips, savoring the vow's power. She snapped her eyes back to Blatt, now gripping that spectral sword like it was lifeline, and demanded he swear on it to smash her sister's curse. Then he locked eyes with her, face unreadable, while that little Arietta watched every breath. She shot her hand toward him, the spectral blade hanging in the space between them, and demanded he swear the oath. Black stared back, and you could tell he'd accepted the challenge. He swore he was ready, then pushed her. Are you really prepared for what this pact demands? She nodded, told him to loosen his power, and said the ritual was seconds from being sealed. The arena exploded in blinding, otherworldly light as raw magic roared to life, while the demon general and Blatt faced off across the glow, and the sword oath ritual hit its terrifying climax. She declared the contract done, final, absolute, while Blatt, calm as ever, shut his eyes as if he'd already swallowed every brutal clause of the formidable.